Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Naruto was blessed by Shinigami in high school DxD. Before I start, please support for more amazing content and do consider subscribing to my channel and share this video with your friends. This is written by the Jingo and link in the description and support writer. Let's start the video. Warmth. Safety. Comfort. Naruto's mind drifted in a sluggish haze of satisfaction and sloth. Rocked gently back and forth, Konoha's #1 most surprising shinobi decided he was never ever going drinking with Kiba again. There was a point where drunken shenanigans moved from boys will be boys to a wild blurred shitshow, and Naruto was pretty damn sure they'd moved far past that milestone. Contrary to what he might tell others when asked, Naruto never forgot a thing that happened when alcohol was running through his veins. So he had very clear memories of being egged into providing a guff-throwing pole dance at several of Konoha's less than classy institutions, having Shikamaru puke in his lap, and getting into a fist fight with Lee that had caused enough public property damage for the village to dock his pay for the next decade. Ah fuck. Well, until Sakura came barging into his room to beat the shit out of him, Naruto was quite content to laze around like a half-formed puddle of goo. A man had to take his jollies where he could get them, and if Naruto had to guess, the previous evening would be the last night before a very long dry spell. Once Tsunade and Sakura got their hands on him, Naruto wouldn't be seeing a drop of sake or a tasty pair of boobs in a long time, war hero or not. If he wasn't feeling so damned lazy, Naruto might even make an effort to shed a dramatic tear or two. As it was, he wouldn't be moving an inch until someone made him. The shaking began with a faint tremor, building slowly and jostling Naruto back and forth. Grumbling to himself, Naruto turned over. The discomfort was too gentle to be Sakura. Hinata maybe. It seemed more her style. Well, it wasn't Tsunade or Sakura for damn sure, so it wasn't quite time yet for him to face the music. Cold hit Naruto like an arctic blast, and he frowned. That was more like Sakura. Bitch. No wonder she was the eternal 20-year-old virgin. He steadfastly denied Sasuke's absence had anything to do with it. Even the bastard had probably managed to pop his cherry at one point, and the whole waiting for Sasuke thing his female teammate had going on had gotten old a few years ago. There wasn't a guarantee that Sasuke would be interested at all when he came back, so the medic was giving up quite a lot of fun for something that might not even happen. Watery blue eyes opened at the hardest jolt, yet to be greeted by the blurred sight of fleshy pink walls. Well, that was odd. He certainly didn't remember summoning any of his toads and asking them to let him sleep it off in their stomachs. Gamakichi better not have gotten any fucking funny ideas, but knowing the little shit, Naruto wouldn't put it past him. The pink's walls gave a great roll, squeezing Naruto like a vice and shoving him towards a faint circle of light. Another squeeze and another shove, and then there were gigantic hands swooping in to catch him by the head and help Naruto's passage along. Giving a grunt of annoyance, Naruto rolled his eyes. Everyone was in on the party, were they? Naruto was more than capable of getting out of a toad's stomach without Chaoji's help, thank you very much. He could almost hear Hinata's quiet voice in his ear admonishing him for his rude thoughts. Well fuck, everyone was entitled to a bad day, weren't they? The final push and Naruto was out into the world. A world full of giant people and the most ridiculously glitzy decorating Naruto had ever seen in his 20 years. Giant people in a giant room. When did he become a midget? How did he become a midget? There was a red-haired giant reaching out for him, and Naruto brought up his hands to try to defend himself. This had to be the most fucked up dream he'd had since that one about Sasuke being a ridiculous flirt, as if that bastard had that much game. Naruto didn't give a shit if this huge guy was a titan. No one beat Uzumaki Naruto in the waking world or the dreaming one. Even if he had to use the pudgiest fists he'd ever had attached to his body to do it. Back off, big man. Nobody was allowed to eat Konoha's #1 prankster. Enormous hands gently took hold of Naruto's squirming body, bringing him close to what was a ridiculously pretty face for giant. It was a ridiculously pretty face for a man too, with blue-green eyes and aristocratic lines that spoke of perfect breeding. The kind smile split the billboard-sized face as the giant forced Naruto into the crook of a muscled arm. Well, aren't you just a little spitfire? Daddy's here, my little fish cake. Rumbled into Naruto's ear and the shinobi's mouth dropped open. What the literal fuck? Was what Naruto had been aiming for. The scream of Waga. Was what his toothless gums actually produced. Just give me whatever you've got. Sasuke ordered quietly, staring at the barkeep with a dull black orb. The lavender Rinnegan was hidden behind the fall of his bangs, a streak of purple color peering out here and there to intimidate anyone that had heard anything about the Fourth Shinobi World War. The barkeep, a middle-aged bald man with a ropey red scar cutting down his cheek, stared at Sasuke for a long pause before shrugging. All we've got round here this time of the afternoon is some rice balls and leftovers. You can have 'em if you want. Was just gonna throw 'em out anyway. Giving the man a slow nod, Sasuke accepted the plate with 3 slightly stale onigiri. Life as a vagabond didn't pay, and unless he wanted to resort to theft the Uchiha had to take what he was offered. So while Sasuke had grown up in the lap of relative luxury, his years as a wanderer had familiarized him with poverty. "Thanks." The Uchiha offered in a parting shot before scanning the room for a free seat. It was the middle of the day, so the inn's tavern was mostly empty. And it was Kei's no Kuni, so few people had the wealth to spend their days indoors, rather than scrabbling out whatever living they could get from the dunes. Picking one on the far side of the room where he could sit with his back to the wall, Sasuke drifted over. Guard the back and watch the exits. Even if Sasuke was the strongest warrior this side of Konoha and perhaps the strongest in the world, if Naruto hadn't kept training old habits died hard. He was a shinobi through and through. Sasuke sunk down, scowling slightly at the faint shake the stool gave beneath him before scooping up one of the onigiri. Pickled plum wasn't as good as tomato by any means, but it was sufficient. Skipping the eye to Takamasu, the Uchiha sunk his teeth into the sour and salty snack. The world wobbled. Chewing slowly, the Uchiha brought up his new left arm and wiped his mouth off the back of a bony hand. It didn't do much good considering his entire body was covered in rags and filth and about 15 years too young for that matter. Sasuke swallowed, tongue swirling along his gums in search of a final grain of rice to try and satisfy the sudden ravenous hunger eating away at his stomach. A swollen moon, wisps of clouds, and a dark forest had replaced the smoky Suna parlor he'd been sitting in. This was one trippy Jinjutsu. Sasuke brought up his right hand into a half seal, knowing full well that using the left was just participating in the illusion. "Kai." He barked, reaching inward for the steady presence of the Rinnegan. Nothing. Uchiha Sasuke didn't consider himself a scholar. He hadn't spent years or decades studying the intricacies of space-time ninjutsu. Strange things sometimes happened. It was a fact of life. With enough chakra or enough sacrifice, transport across the world or even the creation of a pocket dimension could be achieved. However, when Sasuke sunk his teeth into onigiri and found himself in a place and state of being quite different between one crunch of pickled plum and the next, he had to admit something was weird. Uchiha blinked. God damn. What the hell? Over and over that phrase rocked through Naruto's head. There was no other way to react to what the fuck was happening besides complete and total shock. Sure, in his time Naruto had been put into some pretty loopy Jinjutsu. Shinobi he had to fight on missions seemed to like throwing up some pretty bloody stuff. The gorier the better seemed to be their mission statement. But after a while Naruto had gotten used to the horror and it became a game of oh, it's this again. Then Naruto had become friends with Kurama and no illusion could hold him. Being born and carried around by a bunch of giant red-headed weirdos took the cake on the utterly bizarre Jinjutsu scale though. It sounded like the kind of scenario that Ino would have thought up if the blonde Yamanaka was strung out on crack. After the whole being squeezed through enterprise, Naruto could have even appreciated the absurd hilarity of it. But he couldn't feel Kurama. No matter how Naruto scrapped and screamed through the corners of his mind, he couldn't find the damn giant furball. There was just an aching emptiness in the holes of his awareness, torn even deeper by the total absence of chakra. There was something slithering through him, just on the corner of what Naruto could feel. A sensation that was raw and dark and violent. But there was no Biju touching his senses, nor any of the chakra he'd carried with him from the day he was conceived. Naruto was alone. 3 days caged up in a strange little body in a strange big world filled by strange people. And if the Uzumaki was entirely honest with himself, he was a little terrified too. Naruto had no idea how or why the fuck he'd been swept away from everything he knew and loved, but there were limits to what Jinjutsu could do. And Naruto was starting to think that this might be real. Sasuke was familiar with hunger. He'd spent years wandering the shinobi world, wanting to take everything in with eyes unclouded by the need for revenge. Drifting from place to place didn't pay, and while he had gotten by on charity and performing odd jobs for food and shelter, there had been times when he'd gone without anything to eat. The utter gnawing emptiness of 4 days without food in his strange little body was something different. Never before had Sasuke been so utterly consumed by the pang of his empty stomach that his whole focus was narrowed down to the single goal of filling it. It wasn't that the Uchiha hadn't gone such a length of time without nourishment before, since he was a trained shinobi, but it was like his new flesh burned calories at a rate an order of magnitude greater than his old body. Hence why he was crouched in the hedges, hungry black eyes taking in the sight of succulent red apples swaying in the breeze. The orchard was finally emptied after hours of watching, the farmer who tended it along with his other crops tottering off to bed. Sparing one last sweep for other people, Sasuke launched himself forward. He couldn't detect any form of security, but based on the city he had seen on the horizon that belched black smoke, the new world was a queer mixture of agrarian and industrial. Sasuke had no guarantee that there weren't invisible alarm systems or hidden cameras watching his every move. Truthfully, he had no idea what anyone in this new world was capable of. He hadn't spoken to any of its denizens yet. The only thing Sasuke knew was that it was genuine. There was no genjutsu in existence that could overpower his Rinnegan, so if he was in a strange new place with a body that looked to be 5 years old and nothing resembling chakra anywhere, there was a high probability that it was real. He still desperately wanted to know how the fuck he'd apparently been randomly reborn into a different world by eating a goddamn rice ball, but there were no helpful signposts to offer answers. All the Uchiha could do was continue to survive and hope that things became clearer in time. Scurrying up the nearest apple tree, Sasuke plucked one and immediately sunk his teeth into it. Sweetness burst over his tongue, and the taste combined with the satisfaction of finally having something in his gullet was almost enough to make Sasuke forget how he'd been reduced to thievery just to live. Come on, I'm sure mommy's little fish cake is hungry. It's time to fill that tiny tummy. Popping her nipple into Naruto's mouth, Grafia briefly reflected that if anyone had walked in to see her cooing and making funny faces at her infant, she'd die from the embarrassment. The silver-haired woman had a bit of a reputation to uphold, and baby talk didn't exactly fit her public image. Not to mention that Zeoticus would never let her live it down. Her husband would probably consider it a green light for more fooling around. After a long beat, her son began to slowly suckle, and Grafia let out a sigh of relief. Her son always seemed reluctant to begin feeding. It concerned Grafia, since the silver-eyed mother knew just how important it was for babies to get all the nutrients they needed. And although Naruto did always eventually drink his fill of breast milk, the hesitance before he'd start to feed made her worry about his future development. Her baby wouldn't grow up healthy and strong if he started to go off his food in infancy. Cradling the back of Naruto's head, Grafia ran a gentle thumb over the red fuzz crowning his head. It was too early to tell what he'd look like when he was grown, but in coloring her boy took entirely after his father. Naruto and Zeoticus shared their crimson hair and pale skin, though when the cloudy blue of infancy faded away, Naruto might end up with her silver eyes. With a final swallow, Naruto released her pink nipple and gave a quiet burp. Grafia huffed a low chuckle, moving down to tickle the infant's cheek with a soft fingertip. There, that wasn't so bad, was it? I bet you feel better at least. Tiny lips opened up and closed around her finger, toothless gums gnawing away. Naruto might be only 3 months old, but her boy had an attitude. It was almost like babying him irritated the child, and his go-to response for tickling was to squeal and try to bite. The force of the little jaw wasn't nearly enough to hurt, but it did amuse her. A knock sounded on the door of the nursery, giving Grafia a few moments to tug up the front of her shift before her father-in-law cracked the door open. I'm coming in. Zeoticus Gremory warned, slowly pushing the slab of wood inward and stepping through. A hand covered the man's eyes for a few heartbeats before he shrugged and slowly lowered it. The middle-aged man grinned, red ponytail bobbing as he strode across the room to hover above the seated mother. How the little tyke doing today? The head of the Gremory family questioned, light blue eyes unerringly fixated on the form of his grandson. Pregnancies were rare enough in their family, making every child all the more precious. Is he eating well? Yes, he's eating his fill today. Grafia sighed, nudging at an unoccupied rocking chair with her slipper-clad foot. You don't need to loom over me, father. Take a seat. We're not going to bite. Are you sure? A teasing lilt filled Zeoticus's voice, the crow's feet around his eyes crinkling with mirth as he sunk into the nearest seat. Because I have personal experience with Naruto's gnawing habit and I can see that he takes after his mother in the chomping department. Do you want to die? Clenching his hand over his heart, Zeoticus gave an exaggerated pout. Why are you so cold, my dearest daughter-in-law? This old man's heart can't take such cruelty. Quick. I need someone to record my last will and testament before I am slain by my broken heart. Woe is me. Idiot. Ah, my eyes are going dark. I'm lost in a tunnel and I can't stay away from the light. Oh, won't someone save me? Grafia rolled her silver eyes, the movement accompanied by a sudden giggle from her son. Please don't corrupt my son with your foolishness. His father is already a bad enough influence. I don't need your special brand of idiocy compounding it. Ah, the boy has a good sense of humor already. I can feel these things. Zeoticus smirked, running a sagely hand over his crimson stubble before becoming serious once more. I'm sure you've heard enough of it from Zeoticus already, but don't wear yourself out. We have more than enough wealth to hire a few wet nurses. We don't want you to burn out. Hurling her arms, Grafia territorially brought Naruto closer to her generous chest. It is no chore to care for my son. She muttered defensively, smoothing back the infant's cap of red hair. I wish you would all stop harping on about it. Zeoticus brought his hands up in a pacifying gesture. We're only trying to look out for both of you. He explained cautiously. There's no shame in reaching out if you feel overwhelmed. I know Venelana needed help with both Zeoticus and Rias. And if I needed help, I would ask for it. Fair enough. Quiet filled the air, both adults falling silent and watching Naruto, instead of continuing their contentious conversation. The baby wriggled in his mother's arms, cloudy blue orbs shifting from one face to another as his pudgy fist sought out Graphia's silver braids. Woo. Naruto drooled, pink tongue licking at his lips. Would you mind if I held him? Zeoticus smiled reassuringly, hands coming up to accept his grandson when Graphia gave a short nod. The Duke Gremory had not held many children in his life, with Naruto being the third after his now grown son and his 5-year-old daughter, but he knew what to do. Careful to support the infant's head, Zeoticus cradled Naruto in the crook of his left arm. There's a good lad. Naruto frowned, tugging ineffectually at the white sleeves of his grandfather's blazer before subsiding with a grumble. I still think that Milikas would have been a great name. The red-haired man smiled, poking at the baby's stomach with a gentle finger. Not that there's anything wrong with Naruto, but it's certainly not traditional, if you catch my meaning. That was kind of the point. Graphia pointed out dryly. Zeoticus and we felt that after everything that had happened between his Gremory house and my Lucifuge family, not to mention the whole mess with the Lucifer clan, that we wanted something new. Our son won't inherit the mistakes and grudges of his ancestors. We're cutting away the past for him. A pensive look filled Zeoticus's cerulean gaze. Are you sure that you can do that? He pointed out doubtfully. Even if we try to escape it, we are all shaped by the shadows of those that have come before. His name might be a gift of hope, but I'm unfortunately pessimistic. Perhaps you're right. Graphia agreed with just a touch of despair. But what else can we do besides search for a better future? If we don't even try to move forward, we will definitely be defined by the past. We would rather have made the effort and failed than never have bothered at all. Sock-clad feet pounded on the pavement, Sasuke's short legs working overtime to propel the young boy's body through the night. Rain fell in sheets, soaking the Uchiha to the bone and covering the asphalt in puddles. It was cold, wet and miserable, but none of that mattered as much as getting away from his pursuers to Sasuke. The small city was a modern urban center, towers of steel and glass clawing up at the sky. But even though it was vastly different than the more agricultural settlements he'd known in the elemental nations, some things remained the same. Street vendors still hawked their wares, and at the end of a tiring day, their stock was just as ripe for the picking as it would be back home. Ignoring the dirt on his hands, Sasuke rounded a corner and hurriedly began to peel away the lush skin of an orange. His pockets verily bulged with assorted fruits and vegetables, and while he had a start on his pursuers, their long legs were eating away at the distance. The faster he ate, the lighter his pockets would get and the faster he could run. Or if worst came to worst and Sasuke was caught, at least he'd be caught with a full stomach. Sasuke sunk his teeth into the orange, barely tasting the citrus flavor as he swallowed it down. Stealing to survive was something that his parents and ancestors running back a dozen generations would frown on. Uchiha were proud shinobi, and the only stealing they ever did was for the sake of the mission. If they couldn't earn their keep by the sweat of their brow, they were a shame to the clan. Unfortunately, there was no clan to care for his young body in this world. Or perhaps it was fortunate, if simply because the only member of his clan alive was him, and he wasn't disappointing himself when he stole. Sasuke had discarded most of his scruples on his adolescent road to revenge, and when the pressure was on it was easy to ignore Naruto's idealism and fall back into old habits. Silently cursing the burning in his lungs, Sasuke yanked a carrot from a pocket and crunched down on it. He'd have preferred to have peeled the thing, but he was running out of time. He could hear the thud of boots closing in behind him, and unless he managed to find an obstacle to scurry behind, the chase was going to come to a very sudden and very painful end. Damn his weak body. At least his pursuers weren't throwing around the odd form of jutsu they seemed to have in this world. There. Just in the corner of his eye, Sasuke could see a mesh fence barring the distance between two buildings. The Uchiha turned down the alley, forcing his tired body into a dead spread before he leapt. Twisting his fingers into the holes between the metal wire, Sasuke climbed up the barricade like a hairless little monkey. The cool thick bar that marked the top of the barrier settling in his palms, and the Uchiha grinned with triumph. He could practically taste freedom on his tongue. Very few were the people that would consider a few fruits worth the effort of running a bona fide obstacle course. Then a hand hooked the back of Sasuke's shorts, tearing the boy down and throwing him to the ground with a sharp cry of pain. His vision swam as a heavy weight settled over his chest, and the Uchiha threw up his arms to cover his face. Little scamp. Stars exploded as a fist plowed right through his pitiful guard and slammed right into Sasuke's forehead. Rias grinned, all the sunny happiness Naruto had come to expect from his 5-year-old aunt shining from those white teeth, even if one of her child's chompers had fallen out and left a red-haired girl with a gap in her smile. She was just another crimson-haired person in the Gremory family, which Naruto could almost pretend was an alternate world version of his first mother's Uzumaki clan. There was a difference in shade to be sure. The Uzumaki were notorious for red hair, but from what he'd seen of his mother when she'd appeared in his mindscape all those years ago, it was the deep red of thick real blood, which he remembered seeing in transfusion bags in Konoha's hospital. Their eyes were a truer blue as well, running from the clean azure of the sky to the sapphire of the deep sea. The Gremory family had hair the color of blood in stage plays, but which was closer to the crimson Naruto would expect from a rose in the real world. Their blue eyes carried a strong green tint, running from teal to turquoise. But though they had obvious differences, the resemblance was close enough to make Naruto's heart hurt and his mind wander. He couldn't help but conjure up scenarios in his head about the extended family he'd never had. He wondered if Uzumaki Kushina would have been both proud and kind like Grafia. He wondered if his father would have been an attentive goof like Surzich's. He wondered what his grandparents would have been like and if those people he didn't even have a name to label them with would resemble Zeoticus and Venelana. His wandering fantasies were why he suffered the embarrassment of being shuffled from his grandmother's arms and into his aunt's. These people were not Naruto's real family, but for the moment he was willing to put that behind him and admit that at the least they shared genes with the body he was currently inhabiting. That didn't make it any less fucking awkward. Some of the guys back home might be ecstatic about being breathed every day by a beautiful woman with hair the color of titanium, but Naruto didn't have an incest fetish. Or a mommy roleplay fetish for that matter. It was weird as all hell if he was honest, and even though Naruto had to swallow the milk to survive, he wasn't any happier for it. Not only because the novelty of it wore off real damn quick, but being a grown-ass man in a baby's body who a decent woman was unknowingly showing her body off to made the whole situation more than a little rapey. Naruto might be a bit of a pervert, but he'd never in his life knowingly sexually assaulted a woman. And now it felt like he was doing it every day. That guilt was probably why he didn't put up much of a fuss when Rias peered down into his face and whispered in her child's lisp, "Hello Naru." If she wanted to see a baby, by all the kami in heaven he'd show her a baby. Gathering up as much of the girl's crimson strands as his tiny fists could hold, Naruto promptly shoved the hair in his mouth and gave the performance of a lifetime. He gurgled and laughed, grabbing at Ria's fingers when she went to yank the ends of her tresses out of his pie hole. Girls seemed to love the whole infant grasping at their finger thing, so Naruto took hold and held on for dear life, smirking smugly when the 5-year-old visibly turned into a puddle of girly goo. Score 1 for the future Hokage. He'd picked up that little number from watching Sakura and Hinata putter about the village. Contrary to popular belief, Naruto wasn't blind. And he was pretty damn sure that the way those two had gone all googly-eyed and giggly after encountering an infant was what the lads called going baby crazy. Sakura had still been pining her years away after Sasuke, which was pretty unhealthy, but Naruto would have had to have been deaf and dumb to miss the way Hinata had always looked in his direction after an infant episode. Just the thought of it was enough to make Naruto shiver. Not that Hinata was ugly by any means, what with the great big juicy jugs and perfect white skin and delicate features, but Naruto was nowhere near ready for children of his own. He was only 21 years old and had been just breaking into his stride with the ladies. Ino did wonderful things with her tongue and was always down for a no-strings-attached roll in the hay. But he had the strong impression that Hinata would have been a different case. Tapping that ass was surely a one-way trip to marital hell with 2.5 kids and a 9-to-5 salaryman job. Naruto had been so careful to wrap it up and avoid kids, and now he got to be one. Fucking hilarious. Jiraiya would be laughing his wrinkled old ass off in the afterlife. "Here, sweetie." Naruto heard more than saw his grandmother Venelana come up behind him. Soft gentle hands came down to shift his little body around, readjusting Naruto's position and getting rid of the annoying crick in his neck. He doesn't like to complain, but that should be a little more comfortable for him. "Okay grandma." A soft pair of lips brushed against the crown of Naruto's head, filling his tiny nose with the sweet smell of Venelana Gremory's perfume before the brunette woman withdrew. "Ah, shit." Naruto turned his face into the soft silk of Ria's shirt to hide the sudden wetness of his eyes. He needed to get the fuck out of here before he got too attached to want to leave. Konoha was waiting for him to go back and become its Hokage. He had precious people to protect there. Naruto didn't need the complication of precious people to protect over here too. "I like cookies. Chocolate chip ones are the best." "I can tell." Sasuke deadpanned, child's voice just starting to crack. 5 years in what was literally hell, and the once human shinobi was beginning to experience the wonderful phenomena of puberty all over again. Going through the hormone cocktail and sudden bodily changes had been awkward enough the first time around. Suffering it a second time as a devil wasn't exactly at the top of Sasuke's list of things he had always dreamt of doing. Wasn't this whole second life just fucking spectacular? Setting aside the fact that he'd been shoved into the body of a child by some yet unknown meddling deity, because what else but a god could steal him from his own body and stick him in another? The species of that body was apparently some kind of yokai that called themselves devils. It was like Sasuke's life had literally become some kind of absurd fairy tale. In his first life, demons had been little more than murky legends. The Biju might have been called such, but few if any had sincerely believed in the existence of little gremlins that would steal children from the crib to eat them. In his second life, those demons, along with holy spirits like angels and even gods, were very real. Lightning sparked between the Uchiha's fingertips, white blue and just barely singing. A chirp here and there echoed as Sasuke strained his tired flesh to squeeze just a little more of the energy the devils referred to as magic. It felt like scraping the inside of an empty barrel. Painful and desperate as he searched for that last dreg of sustenance that would make the difference between success and failure. Swallowing the last crumb of her chocolate chip cookie, Office peered at the fragile electric star with vague interest. Too little power. The Gothic Lolita advised dryly as the spell backfired, burning yet another path of blisters on Sasuke's hand. Some of the older swollen sores popped, oozing hot and wet as the Uchiha's flesh was ruined just a little bit more. Swearing violently under his breath, Sasuke gave it up for a lost cause. There would be no more attempts to recreate a Chidori with magical energy as its base this day. Just another failure in a long line of failures. Any other brilliant advice for me to keep in mind for the next time? The Uchiha growled at Office, knowing he sounded rude and ill-tempered, but so frustrated he didn't care. Office slowly blinked, tilting her head in a vaguely considering manner as she took in the dark-haired boy. No. Then she disappeared in a puff of oily black smoke, leaving Sasuke alone once more. TCH. Looking up at Gehenna's artificially created magical sun, Sasuke clenched his aching fists. It seemed that his second childhood was a repeat of the first one in which the Uchiha was too weak. In the new world he had nothing. No family. No chakra. No status. No power. No Sharingan. Everything he'd ever achieved had been wiped away. All Sasuke's triumphs and defeats were reduced to nothing. He wasn't Uchiha Sasuke, the former international criminal that struck fear into the hearts of thousands with a gesture. He was just Uchiha Sasuke, the low-class peasant devil with nothing to his name. But if Naruto could climb to the top of the shinobi world despite having no natural talent, Sasuke could do the same in the underworld realm devils called Gehenna. The vagabond's lip curved wryly as he made an oath to the empty air. I'm not giving up yet, dope. Tomorrow would be a new day and a new chance to force his rebellious and weak magic into something useful. Sooner or later, Sasuke would succeed in recreating the Chidori. Hopefully Office returns soon. She was the only form of instructor Sasuke had in this second life. If he had to take a stab at her motives, Sasuke would assume that she was just a bored Oji-sama looking for a thrill. Even her name, Office, sounded like the kind of moniker some queer foreign nobleman would give his daughter. If not for the odd girl popping in and out of his life for the past half a decade, the Uchiha was sure he'd have died. From starvation if nothing else. Accepting charity rankled his pride, but if some spoiled rich little devil kid wanted to follow him around to pay for his meals and give him snippets of advice on magecraft, Sasuke didn't have the luxury to refuse. The nearly limitless lifespan devils were supposed to have wasn't making Sasuke feel any more patient. He wanted the power and the status of a highly ranked devil, and he wanted it soon. Sasuke was more than willing to sweat and bleed to get ahead in the world, so it followed he'd at least be pragmatic enough to take advantage of the opportunities Office offered. The future of the Uchiha clan was depending on him, and Sasuke fully intended to resurrect his name, even if it was in a new world as a clan of devils. Imijima Akeno was being hunted. The black ponytail bobbed as the half-human half-fallen angel girl threw herself over the hood of a car stuck in traffic. The enraged owner of the red Toyota honked at her, furious about the dents left behind by her boots, but the 10-year-old didn't really give a hoot. Her mother had raised her to be polite and courteous, but Akeno doubted that Shuri would nitpick when her daughter's life was on the line. Every quick glance over her shoulder revealed the forms of her human clansmen, finally closing in to kill the monster and wipe away the stain on the Himejima family honor. Well, stain or not, Akeno didn't intend to go down without a fight. Swinging down a side street, Akeno scanned the buildings with sharp violet eyes. Her great uncle and his cronies had far more experience killing things, but unlike Akeno, they hadn't survived a year and a half on the streets after their mothers were murdered. Lay the common rules for secrecy and shielding the mundane shared by all magicians on top of that, and the 10-year-old had a pretty good chance of getting away. Cities were Akeno's turf, and if they couldn't throw fireballs at her they'd find it very difficult to tie her down. Akeno smirked as she rounded a corner and found herself running towards a slowly filling city bus. The expense would eat into her savings a bit, but she'd built up a good nest egg selling exorcisms and making charms. Her priestess magic was a bit shoddy, since her mother had died before Shuri could teach Akeno everything, but at least her spells worked. Quality paid and all that. Shoving a hand into the pocket of her faded jeans, Akeno dropped a handful of coins into the waiting palm of the bus operator and climbed aboard. It didn't really matter where it took her, because anywhere was better than the city center with her murdering kin on her heels, and they wouldn't dare break the rules by trying to kill her in the middle of a crowded bus. Breathing a long sigh of relief, the half-breed took a seat and leaned her forehead against the cool glass of the window. She was safe for long enough to catch her breath. Perhaps it would be best if Akeno left Hokkaido for a while. The Himejima clan had their domain in the Kansai region, so the northern island was the furthest the 10-year-old could get unless she left Japan entirely. Or ran off to some distant Pacific backwater like Yonaguni, she supposed, but going to some rural community wouldn't be wise. It was easier to survive when there were people to blend in with. Part of her wished her father were here, if only so the useless lump could demonstrate some of the power that made him a high-ranking officer in the fallen angel government. Barakiel had failed to keep her mother safe from his enemies, and if the bastard couldn't stick around to look after Shuri, he shouldn't have been in their lives in the first place. But Akeno's mother was dead, and she could really use some of that strength to chase off her uncle right about now. Akeno rode the bus as long as she could, watching the sun slowly turn red and begin to sink into behind the mountains to the west. Eventually, a last quiet electrical beep filled the air, and the girl had to shuffle out of the vehicle with the other remaining stragglers. Faint yellow electric lamps lit up the early evening, throwing sinister shadows over the pavement, and Akeno turned and began speed walking back towards the city center. She'd avoided her pursuers, but she needed to double back. She needed to get back to where there were so many people her clan couldn't magically erase all memories of a clash. Just as I thought. Imajima Shu stepped out of the darkness, wrinkles drawn taut in a ferocious frown. Her great-uncle's midnight strands had grayed in old age, but the cold amethyst of his eyes were just as sharp as they'd ever been. You may know this city better than most of the clan, Abomination, but I've been hunting since before your mother was a sparkle in my brother's eye. Once you got on that bus, I knew you would ride it as long as you could. You're not as smart as you think you are. Humming an effuda, Akeno clenched her jaw and took a cautious step back. She needed to leave. She needed to be gone right now because half-fallen angel or not, a few years of tips from her mother wouldn't be worth a damn thing weighed against the most skilled Onmyaji in Kyoto. If she could just stun him for a second, she might be able to run and hide. Perhaps an explosion of pure light. It's useless. Another voice cut in, deep and hard, drawing Akeno to spin to face the newcomer. More men and women moved out of the shadows, clad in a mixture of casual clothes, but all bearing the hallmark spark to their auras of trained magicians. You're surrounded, kiddo. It is time to end this. Go quietly, and it will be relatively painless. A plain-faced man told her, purple eyes dull. Akeno grit her teeth, ignoring the rising tide of panic. Every nerve in her brain was burning in tandem with the frantic beat of her heart. There was some way out of this. She refused to die here, a forgotten stain in the oh-so-pure annals of the Himejima clan's history. Once upon a time her human mother had dared to fall in love with a fallen angel, and Akeno would not be swept under the rug as a shame. Dropping her other hand into her pocket, Akeno grabbed every effuda she could lay her 10-year-old hands on. With her mother's clan pressing in at every corner, she wouldn't be able to get out without a fight. But if she could at least distract them all with a pulse of blinding light, she might live another day. The half-fallen angel shoved the majority of her power into a large yellow runic circle, streamlined for the light magic angels and fallen angels were known for. Every line in the circle grew brighter with every heartbeat, drawing on the power of fallen angels, until each glowing character shone bright as the sun. I'm not going to let you kill me. Akeno declared, relying on her half-trained sorcery to summon destruction along with a light show. For a few seconds, Akeno hoped. She hoped the wild surge of desperation and intent would be enough to make up for the difference in skill between her and her clansmen. The sound of a sharp clap broke the standoff, and a pair of strangers stepped out onto the street. I think that's quite enough. A blonde foreigner smiled, blue eyes harsh. The heavy weight of that gaze considered Akeno before swiveling to stare at Shu. This girl did a good turn for one of my contractors, so I think that deserves a little something in return. Bright crimson hair shone ethereally under the electric street lamps as the blonde man's companion studied Akeno. The girl looked no older than the runaway, but behind that elfin face Akeno could practically taste the spark of black power. This business is of no interest to you, devil. Shu clenched his jaw, visibly displeased by the interruption. Cloth rustled as the half-dozen members of the Himejima clan standing in the thoroughfare stepped into defensive positions. Akeno was still their target, but she was a half-trained girl. No experienced Onmyaji would turn their back on a devil leaking so much magical presence. The blonde sighed, shoving one hand in a pocket while the other came up to stroke over the wiry strands of his goatee. Now my old wrinkly liver-spotted friend, that just isn't so. You see, this city is Gremory clan territory. And anything you humans get up to on my master's territory is my business, you feel me? Bloodthirsty intent filled the night, making a cold sweat break out on more than one mortal's skin. You lot don't even get to take a shit without my knowledge. Now, I consider myself a fair sword, Mr. 28 head of the Himejima clan. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa doesn't start spilling guts right off the bat. I'll give you, say, 5 minutes to get out of Dodge. After that, I'll see if I can still scalp an exorcist. Heinrich, enough. The red-haired girl gave Heinrich a pat to the hip. It's no wonder my father never sends you to negotiate anything. Ignoring the way the older devil made an exaggerated pout, the little mistress turned her attention towards the fuming Shu. I am Rias Gremory, daughter of the lord of the clan. I'll settle things with you on its behalf. Lightning began to spark from the effuta clenched between Shu's fingers. I don't make deals with your kind. Then consider this an ultimatum. Rias shot back irritably, shaking her head. On Yaoji and their pride. This girl has your look, but I can sense the fallen angel magic in her. I'm going to guess she's a half-breed stain on the family honor or some such nonsense, and you intend to get rid of her. Akeno snorted softly. I see someone likes playing detective in her spare time. I'll get to you in a minute. Turquoise eyes narrowed at the rude girl before Rias switched her focus back to Shu. So what I will do is take this girl with me. She won't set foot in your clan lands on pain of death and she will stay by my side. In exchange, my father's bishop here won't liquefy the lot of you right here and trigger a clan war that you humans would lose badly. Shu looked nearly apoplectic as he gave a jerky nod. He dearly wanted to wipe the smug grin off the blonde demon. He wanted to eradicate the little genius Gremory heiress before she became an even bigger threat to the human world in the future. He wanted to finally wipe away the stain on clan pride that was his grandniece. But Shu wasn't stupid, and decades of experience in demon slaying all warned off the same result. Even if they all moved at their best, Agrippa would annihilate them. Effuta were hardly the holy weapons of legend that were needed to close the gap in power between humans and devils. Watching as her grand-uncle and his men left in a cloud of wounded outrage, Akeno warily focused on the pair of devil nobles. While murderous, at least her clansmen were a known quantity. These strangers were total unknowns, and the only thing she could say about them was that they seemed interested in preserving her life. Woo, glad that's over. Agrippa whistled, stretching his arms over his head. For a while there I thought things were going to get a little messy. That would be no thanks to you. How anyone could consider you a nerd scholar is beyond me. Akeno twitched. These were the bloodthirsty demons her mother had always warned her about. The bloody streamer lazily coiled between his fingers and with a sigh Naruto extinguished the sinister crimson aura. The Bale clan's power of destruction that he inherited from his new father had a dark sort of beauty to it. Bright as an evil star orbiting a void, a single strike with the demonic energy could reduce almost anything to ash and ruin. It seemed like Naruto was fated to have access to some form of unholy power in every life. Being born a literal devil made it practically guaranteed. But compared to devil magic, at least Kurama had been self-aware and good at heart. The red light swirling in Naruto's veins and spilling out with twitch of the finger was a mass of raw, unfiltered malevolence. The thrill Naruto got every time he summoned it made him feel just a touch guilty. Fighting had never been so easy. 5 years old and the Devil Society Naruto had been reborn and was already calling him a genius. Even by the standards of the aristocrat families that made up the 72 pillars of the underworld, Naruto was an uncommonly powerful child. Part of it was probably being 25 years old in a kid's body, but the rest of it was the skilled flesh he'd been lucky enough to be born in. 5 years had a way of making his new body feel less odd. Naruto had the time to adjust to the smaller limbs and the deep red hair he inherited from his second father. His appearance wasn't ridiculously different compared to the foggy memories of his first blonde body. Besides the color change and the lack of whisker birthmarks, Naruto had actually come out looking pretty close compared to his previous body. It wasn't the appearance that got him. It was the family that did. New body in a new world. Sure, it was strange as fuck. But compared to the Kagaya clusterfuck, it wasn't as bad as it could have been. What kept Naruto up at night was trying to reconcile his new family with his old one. The Gremory clan weren't bad people. Dad the demon lord Suitors Lucifer, not the Hokage Namikaze Minato was kind and brave and everything Naruto had ever wanted for a father growing up. Grandpa Zo was a jolly pervert after his own heart. Granny Lana and Mom were a far cry away from Uzumaki Kushina strict and proper, where his first mom had been loud and crude, but all three women had a deep well of affection and willingness to nurture. Rias was less his aunt and more like his twin, loyal and generous to a fault. Naruto could freely admit he loved them. Every member of his strange new family had captured his heart in their own way. Even his cousin Saraerd Bale, that battle-loving maniac, was too humble and compassionate not to admire. It was almost like a dream to have so many precious people who loved him simply because he existed, rather than because he'd managed to earn their affection. But was that really okay? Suitors Lucifer might have patiently taught Naruto how to tap into the well of demonic power inside of him, but Namikaze Minato had died for him and Konoha. Grafia Lucifuge might betray her strict manner to sneak him cookies, but Uzumaki Kushina had taken an enormous 9-month risk just to carry Naruto to term as a Jinchuriki. In his head, Naruto knew neither of his original parents would hold a grudge against him for such simple happiness as having a good second childhood. But that didn't stop his heart from nagging at him every time he called his new parents mom and dad and forgot for a few hours the sacrifices Minato and Kushina had made for his future. Isaiah was struggling through the book of Daniel when Esther yanked the Bible out of his hands and hid it behind her back. "Give that back." The blonde boy grunted, leaping up off his stool and lunging for the corner of the book. "Nope." Esther sing-songed, twisting back and forth to keep it out of her fellow orphan's hands. Brown braids bounced as the matcha-skinned girl danced around Isaiah, sticking her tongue out at him. Only losers hide up in the schoolroom when Sister Judith is baking up biscuits. Abruptly coming to a stop, Isaiah narrowed gray eyes suspiciously. "You're not having me on, are you?" Esther shrugged, tossing the worn black tome back at the younger child. "That's for me to know and you to find out." The 7-year-old winked a brown eye before spinning on her heel and dashing out of the small classroom. Biting his lip, Isaiah looked between the Bible and empty doorway before giving a groan. This better not be a prank. Then he carefully placed the dog-eared religious text back on the shelf before following after the older girl at a slower pace. It wouldn't be the first time Esther had pulled the wool over his eyes, and it probably wouldn't be the last. She called Isaiah a total nerd for studying so hard all the time. Frankly, Isaiah didn't know why all the other kids didn't study as much as he did. He might be only 5 years old, but he wasn't dumb. The blonde knew there was no reason for the church to have to pick up random orphans from the street like him. Sister Judith and Father Roland had chosen to do it, even though money was always tight in the group home. Between life on the streets as the kid scrounging for food in the trash and the orphanage where they took care of him and even gave him a name, Isaiah would choose the orphanage every time. The least he could do is keep his nose clean, not start fights with the other kids, and work hard. One day Isaiah was going to be a priest just like Father Roland and help the other street rats. Or maybe he'd defend mankind against devils and fallen angels, even though just thinking about having to fight such horrible creatures made Isaiah's blood run cold. Wafting in the air was the heady smell of ginger, and reluctantly Isaiah began to smile. So, Esther hadn't been taking the mickey after all. Ginger snaps were the blonde's favorite, and every time Sister Judith baked them, he remembered that one cold night 6 months ago when the nun had taken him in from the wet streets of Glasgow. "Hello, little scholar." The elderly nun greeted when Isaiah stepped into the kitchen. Most of the children had already come and gone, but Judith had set aside a plate for the 5-year-old. Isaiah was still struggling to connect with the other children in a way that didn't deal with just surviving, and it saddened her to see one so young be so scarred. "I saved some for you." "Thanks, sister." Scooping up one of the light brown biscuits, Isaiah crammed it in his mouth. The ginger snap was still warm and soft from the oven, gently giving way beneath his teeth, and the blonde closed his eyes at the taste. So perfect and delicious. "There's a cup of milk here for you too. After you're done, I'd like it if you would go outside and play with the other children for a few hours." Okay. Judith hummed in satisfaction, moving back over to the oven and flipping a burner on. The nun filled a beaten iron cast kettle with tap water before settling it over the open flame. "I'm making tea for Father Roland and his guest, but I can set you out a cup too if you'd like." "No thanks, I'm good." Isaiah frowned in thought, chewing at another biscuit. "Who's here to see Father Roland?" "I didn't hear anything from the other kids about it." "It's just Father Valper," Judith replied as the kettle began to hiss steam. "Nothing to worry about." Isaiah watched as the old woman poured 2 cups of black tea. It might be nothing to worry about, but the blonde could see the displeased tightness in the corners of her mouth. He hadn't managed to survive so long on the streets without learning to read a face, and Isaiah came to a snap decision. "I'll give you a hand before I go outside." "You're such a kind boy." Fondness colored Judith's voice, and Isaiah could feel a pleased flush come to his cheeks. "It's nothing." Following Judith across the group home, he balanced a small milk jug in one hand and their beat-up sugar jar in the other. The orphanage didn't have anything as fancy as a real tea set, but they could make do with what they had. No British family went without their afternoon tea, or so Father Roland joked, and their household was no different. They were real family, lacking blood ties didn't matter. The nun knocked on the door of the priest's study, giving 3 sharp raps before pushing inward. "Ah, thank you, sister." Unlike Judith, Father Roland was young. Bright ginger curls shone under the sunlight slanting in from the window. The square planes of Roland's jaw were unshaven and smooth. No wrinkles surrounded the blazing green eyes behind his wire-framed round spectacles. Beneath the crisp lines of his suit was a body lined with muscle. He looked less like the director of a group home and more like a bookish martial artist. Considering the priest was an actual exorcist, it was probably to be expected. Killing demons required a little bit of heavy lifting. "And I see you brought little Isaiah with you." "I'm not little." Letting the rest of the small talk fly over his head, the blonde 5-year-old crossed the room to set the milk and sugar down on the coffee table. Gray eyes boldly swept over the visitor, bringing a small smirk to the stranger's lips. Roland's guest was everything Isaiah would have expected from a stereotypical priest. The man's body was short and round, the curve of his gut pressing against the cloth of his vestments. A round white Akeno held down a wiry spring of grayed ringlets. Sunken black eyes nestled in the wrinkled folds of the elderly man's face. "Please don't stare at Father Valper, child," Judith warned, prompting the older priest to wave off her light scolding. "I don't mind. It's not every day that you get to meet strangers, and children are so curious." Valper shifted his attention back to Roland, sipping at his tea in thought. "But back to the matter at hand. I understand you have some reluctance, but this is not something you can refuse. The orders have come down from the conclave, and while I can only take volunteers, you don't have the right to prevent me from asking the children directly." The tense muscle jumped in Roland's cheek as his jaw clenched. "Isaiah, go out and play," the young priest ordered, green orbs burning like fire and never wavering from their guest. "Judith, make sure none of the children are hiding around inside today. They should be out in the sunlight." "Don't be like that." Valper shook his head, lips peeling back into a sleazy smirk. "He's already here, so why don't I see what he thinks?" "Isaiah is too young to participate in your little project." "There is hardly an age requirement, my friend, and it's not my project. It's the church's." "I want to know." Shaking off Judith's hand when the elderly nun grabbed at his shoulder, the blond boy stepped into the fat priest's line of view. "What do you want with me?" Valper's dark gaze grew heavy with intent and the wrinkled man gulped down the rest of his unsweetened tea before settling the cup firmly on the table. "My boy, have you ever heard of the holy swords?" "Of course." The blonde may be new to the church, but he'd been living under its roof for half a year. Isaiah wouldn't have missed something as important in the fight against evil as the various holy swords created by God. Famous blades like Kalbrand and Excalibur were fueled by the power of heaven and could easily cause lethal damage to devils and other demons. Even the mass-produced inferior swords made out of hardened light could cut such creatures to the bone. Roland glowered with impotent anger, but the young priest had no authority over the older one. "Yes, well, there is little difficulty in having almost anyone wield one of the common blades. It is difficult to find someone with enough of God's light inside of them to use the true holy swords. The church is in the difficult position of having more holy swords than wielders, so it has decided to see if we can find a way to artificially add light element to humans and allow them to use the legendary weapons to defend the church." "And you want me to become part of this?" "Isaiah, no." Satisfaction light up Valper's face despite Judith's outburst. "Exactly. Of course, it's not going to be all fun and games. Not every child would be willing to give up so much for the church. So it's alright if you're afraid and would rather not." "I am not afraid." Isaiah bit out, face flaming. The church had taken him in from the streets, clothed and fed him, and given him a name. What was a little work compared to all that? "I will go with you." Porcelain shattered in Roland's fist, hot tea scalding over the young priest's hand. Valper Galilei chuckled with amusement. "I knew you had it in you, my boy." Red light shattered, power bucking against her will and extinguishing with an explosion that blew Rias off her feet. Hitting the opulent tile of her private ballroom in a pained heap, the crimson-haired ruined princess gave a huff of frustration. "Giving up so soon, Sama." Akeno peered down at her mistress and closest friend with violet eyes. It had been 5 years since Rias and Zeoticus's bishop stepped out of the cool Hokkaido night and chased off her murderous relatives. She'd been suspicious and surly for a long time, staying only because of the deal she'd been strong-armed into. But slowly she'd found affection growing like a weed, watered by Ria's generosity and lack of expectations. The black-haired reincarnated devil nudged at the red-haired girl with her sock-clad foot. "I thought you had a little more stamina, but I guess a little rough play tuckers you right out." "I'll show you rough play." Rias muttered darkly, calling up a swirl of her power of destruction and directing the wild flow at her queen. Akeno lazily broke the crimson tide with a crackle of yellow lightning before plopping down beside the Gremory princess. 3 years ago Akeno had accepted the queen piece from Rias and joined her friend's peerage. She'd been reincarnated from half-human and half-fallen angel into a devil and never regretted it for a single moment. Silence hung in the air as each young woman pondered their own thoughts. It was no secret that within her immediate family, Rias was by far the weakest. Her parents had centuries of experience and had honed their magic to an art form. Zeoticus was not merely her elder, but had attained the exalted title of Satan. When her own brother had taken both the position of Demon Lord and the Lucifer name from the original Satan Lucifer's clan, it was pretty difficult to measure up. Her sister-in-law Graphia was an ultimate class devil on the level of a Satan and widely acknowledged as the strongest devil holding one of the queen pieces. Even her nephew Naruto was hailed as a young genius with the Bale clan's power of destruction. Compared to them, Rias felt weak and clumsy. Her use of the power she'd inherited from her mother was heavy-handed. She was proficient with the spells common to all devils, but Rias was no prodigy sorceress. The only thing that made her stand out was her towering intellect, which still paled in comparison to the battle experience of her elders who'd lived hundreds or thousands of years. Rias Gremory was not a battle-obsessed maniac. She didn't hunger to be the strongest on the field and obliterate her foes. She wasn't driven to seek out war to prove herself and her dominance. When her dream was to be loved for who she was as a person, rather than because of her family name or social status, being a skilled combatant didn't even really enter into her considerations. But Rias had her pride. Even if she wasn't a warrior, she refused to be a failure. She'd seen how the Bale clan had treated Saraerg with utter contempt for years when it was discovered he hadn't inherited the power of destruction. Devils from the highest echelons of their society to the lowest had sneered behind their hands at her cousin's weakness and lack of fortune. Saraerg had proved them all wrong and was seen as the strongest devil in their generation, but it was a hollow victory. As powerful as he was, his own clan still rejected him for lacking their ancestral magic. Devils were hardly perfect. They held onto their prejudices just as much as any human. Even if he proved to be strong, Saraerg was probably still a source of shame in his parents' hearts. Especially in the heart of the notoriously cold Lord Bale. Ria's family wouldn't throw her out or disinherit her for her lack of skill. But if she didn't blossom into a splendid ultimate-class devil, would they secretly be ashamed of her? Would they, even if they weren't aware of it, love her a little less for it? The servants had certainly swelled up with subtle disrespect over the years as Naruto passed milestones in his magical training years younger than Rias had. Why would her family be any different? Her unofficial claim to being heir to the clan was based around being the default choice. Zeoticus had given up the Gremory name to become the warlord Satan Lucifer, and the other branches of the family had far less direct blood relation to the current Duke Gremory than she did. For years she'd known her place in the world, preparing every day to succeed her father and rule the clan fairly and with foresight. Then Naruto had started throwing magic around, and suddenly all of her expectations about her future were thrown out the window. Maybe her nephew was just an early bloomer and would hit a wall in his growth, but that hadn't stopped the constant whispers. Secret discussions among the maids about how the little prince would surely be named heir despite convention regarding the children of the Satans. Snide barbs about her weakness from her distant cousins at family functions just barely cloaked in courtesy. And most painfully, thoughtless comments by her own parents when they congratulated Naruto for figuring out something quicker than Rias had. Bouncy, bouncy, bouncy. Akeno purred as she began to poke her manicured fingers into the swell of her mistress's chest. The generous flesh jiggled beneath the perverse sadist's ministrations. 1 bounce, 2 bounce, 3 bounce she chanted, alternating pokes so the Ria's breasts wobbled in opposition. Turquoise eyes narrowed. What are you doing? You shouldn't think too deeply sometimes, Haim-sama. It doesn't help. It'll only make you sad. Arching a fine brow, the priestess gave a generous squeeze. If you're unsatisfied with your performance, you only need to work harder. Are you having a moment? Naruto's voice cut in as he entered the room, drawing the attention of the two girls. Is this a moment? Because it sounds like a moment. Doesn't really look like one though. The son of the Crimson Satan folded his arms over his chest and leaned against the doorframe. Naruto-sama, if you can't recognize a moment between two fine and upstanding ladies like the mistress and myself, I weep. Akeno gave an exaggerated pout. Only a lout would show such disregard for the delicate heart of a woman. Laying a hand over his heart, Naruto marshaled his chubby child's face into the haughtiest expression he could muster. Show me a woman, Himejima-san, and I will show you just how well I can take care of her delicate heart. Ara Naruto-sama. If I didn't know better, I'd say that was an insult. And I know it wasn't an insult because if it was one, someone would have to be punished. Smiling beatifically, Akeno winked. Do you think someone wants to be punished, Naruto-sama? Naruto just offered an throaty hum in reply. You can stop playing with my breasts anytime, you know. Just going to put it out there. Yes, I know. A drawn-out silence. Boy, stop that. There's only so long a brother can let his sister be molested in front of him before it gets awkward. His feet were bleeding, red seeping through the cracked skin of Sasuke's heels. Heartbeat thundering in his ears, Sasuke threw himself over a boulder and pushed deeper into the thicket. Towering trees rose up around him, casting thick shadows that hid the Uchiha from the blazing pale artificial moonlight. Every step was an agony, but Sasuke had no choice. He forced his aching muscles to propel him further into the underbrush, ignoring the slowly building fire in his lungs. It was run or die. The years had not been kind to Sasuke. The underworld they called Gehenna was a land of plenty, but only for those with means, and the only way to attain that fabulous wealth was to be born into it or to become a servant for those with it. Sasuke was no man's servant. Even if hunger had carved him down to lean muscle, and even if he wore a mixture of stolen clothes and what he could scavenge from the corpses of the stray criminals he'd killed, the Uchiha had been too proud to grovel to some blue-blooded stranger for the chance to serve. He was the last of his clan, and no Uchiha had ever gone begging for handouts from other families. That arrogance had come back to bite him in the ass, sinking gleeful teeth into his flank and tearing away until Sasuke had to acknowledge his own folly. It would have been better to bend his neck for a time than get put down like a dog. "Run, little devil," howled out through the night, punctuated with streaks of blue. Spears of light crashed through the canopy, their random trajectory only adding to the destruction. The fallen angel was interested in one thing only: the hunt, and Sasuke was the prey. It was an old story. Angels, created by the God of the Bible to slay demons and protect mankind, grew corrupted with lust and greed over time. They then fell to Gehenna, white wings turned black with sin, and continued to kill and torment their ancient enemies. The Uchiha was merely one more devil in a long line of bloody conflict, and he would either survive or join the thousands of corpses fallen angels had made of his kind. If Sasuke had been part of some noble devil's peerage, he'd be able to call his master for reinforcements. There would be at least one of those evil pieces inside of him. Well, he had no need to reincarnate from a human to a devil. The enchanted chess pieces also each bestowed a different type of power on the servant they'd been given to. Sasuke would be stronger and more likely to survive with an evil piece, even if he had to swallow his pride to get one. As it was, the fallen angel who introduced himself as Dona was just playing with him. The war between the three biblical factions might be considered over by most, but no peace treaty had ever been signed. Sasuke was a devil that had unknowingly wandered too close to the territory of the fallen angels, and thus was still the prime target for a bit of sport. Launching himself into a thick cluster of brambles, the Uchiha ignored the bite of thorns into his flesh and curled as close to the ground as he could. When his enemy was stronger than him with powers that were deadly to his kind and he was ill-rested and starving, there was only one option left to Sasuke. Hide and hope that whatever greater deity looked after the devils would ensure that he lived past the night. Sasuke covered his mouth with a bloody hand, smothering the desperate sound of his panting. Dark eyes peered into the gloom while his ears strained to catch any sound over the trembling heartbeat in his ears. Wind rustled through the trees, disturbing the silence with the creak of branches and the brush of leaves. It was too quiet, the sudden lack of noise suffocating after the rending panic of the chase. The feeling of wrongness pervaded Sasuke's hyper-aware senses. It whispered in the black reaches of his mind. "You're about to die." Sasuke was 15 years old, or 30 years old, depending on how he looked at it. He'd lived a long time as a shinobi in one world, staining his hands with murder and breathing death. He lived a decade in the next world, training his devil flesh with single-minded intensity. In both worlds, his body had been his to command a finely tuned instrument of violence that Sasuke controlled with a steel grip. It did not move without his command. It didn't feel without his command. But some things were intrinsic. No matter how many years were spent conditioning, his body still had its natural reactions. Not even a shinobi was the total master of his own flesh. When the body is in danger of extinction, it reacts, and no training can beat that response out. Sasuke was about to die, and despite decades living as a shinobi, he was afraid. "Hey? I haven't heard anything today. Why?" Keko blinked, a slow and steady fluttering of white lashes over gold eyes. "No reason." Scratching a nail over the wiry tangles of his blonde beard, a grip appeared down at the tiny white-haired reincarnated devil before shrugging. "I don't mind telling you if I hear of anything odd happening out in Gehenna, but if you told me what you were looking for I might have better luck." "I am not looking for anything in particular," she denied, tilting her head in wordless thanks before walking away from Zeoticus Gremory's bishop. For another devil lying to a fellow servant they'd known for years might sting at their conscience, but Keko had breathed falsehood and silence for so long that it was practically second nature. Openly fishing for information about her sister was risky. Kuroko was a highly classed criminal and a traitor, and Keko didn't want to give people ideas about her loyalty. She was Tauju Keko, faithful rook to Rias Gremory, and one of the last Nekomata in any world. She wasn't kin to Kuroko anymore. She wasn't Shirin anymore. No amount of dreaming about the blood and screams as Kuroko slaughtered their first master and their household would change that resolve. Breathe in. Breathe out. The ice. Draining out her emotions was getting harder and harder over time. Keko could still bleed away all her feelings until nothing was left but cool stillness like rime over a lake, but much of the time a random image of the Gremory family would pop into her head. The Nekomata stepped out onto one of the many terraces in the manor. Amber orbs peeked out under heavy eyelids as she considered Rias and Akeno. Both young women were silently sipping at steaming cups of tea and staring off into the horizon past a well-groomed lawn. Keko didn't bother to greet them, simply moving over to stiffly sit in one of the many steel-framed patio chairs. "Hello, Keko-chan. what are you up to today? Rias shifted her attention from the distant yard to the white-haired devil at her side. A slow friendly smile curved the Retide's lips, and ignoring propriety, she poured a cup of tea for the rook. Large helpings of sugar and milk sweetened the brew to suit Kaneko's feline tastes, before Rias pushed the cup and saucer over with a single pale finger. Accepting the tea without a twitch, the 10-year-old Nekomata lifted it to her lips and took a small sip. The cool sugary sweetness would have turned the stomach of another devil, but it was just perfect for Kaneko. Nothing. Akeno hummed, listening to the short exchange with one ear. That is part of the charm around here. Quiet lazy days stretching on forever. Huffing a small laugh, Rias gave her queen a wry look. They hardly stretch on forever. Just next week father intends on paying a visit to the Kyoto Yokai and he wants us to come along. That would be neither quiet nor lazy. Crystal chimed as Akeno set her porcelain cup down on the glass table firmly. That would be unwise. She grimaced, turning to look at her mistress. The Yokai of Japan essentially have free run of the city and because of that all the Onyaji clans tend to hold territory in the surrounding countryside. It's a rather delicate cold war they have going on. If your father pays them a visit, the clans may think that there is some movement towards alliance and attack out of desperation. That will not happen as long as Yosaka is in the city. The Onyaji will not move first. They fear the Nine Tails too much. Kaneko offered dully, watching the play of sunlight reflect off a particularly vivid cluster of daylilies. Well, Shirin and Kuroka had been among the last surviving members of the Nekashu subspecies, but they had still been Nekomata Yokai. Even after being reincarnated into devils, the doings of Yokai had remained topics of interest. There is also the fact that my uncle may consider it a violation of your deal with him. Rias digested that for a few moments, shrugging one pale shoulder and letting the strap of her pale camisole slip down. That is always a possibility I suppose. Shall we simply not go then? That will hurt your standing in the clan. A thick silence curled between them, Naruto's name floating unspoken between them. Considering the sheer speed Naruto seemed to grasp magic and the way he excelled at all of his studies, Kaneko knew that the perception of Rias as heiress was not strong. When the civil war between devils had ended, the new Satans had to give up their own clan names and use the name of the old Satans. While the title of Satan wasn't hereditary, it was assumed that the Satans would raise their children to succeed them. Naruto was a Grimoire by legality only, and no one would have been shocked if he became Naruto Lucifer in the future. A Satan could not also be a clan leader. It was a concentration of too much power in the hands of one devil, and their government had explicitly banned it. But that hadn't stopped the gossip. Naruto was just as much a genius as his father. He was much wiser and more learned than a child his age had the right to be. He had a certain charisma about him. The only thing Rias had going for her was her genius, and most devils would rather follow a general with a sword than a bookish woman. I don't care. Rias declared, settling a hand over Akeno's hand and giving a reassuring squeeze. I'd rather protect my friends. Let them whisper. Kaneko sighed, turning her teacup in her hands and watching the last drops of beej roll around. That emotional weakness was exactly why Ria's expectations of clan leadership were going up in smoke, even if it was also why the ruined princess had managed to wriggle into Kaneko's and Akeno's scarred hearts. Shivering just barely in the cold, Voli rolled the spark wheel of his cheap lighter. It took a few times for a flame to spark, but eventually the 18-year-old half-devil managed to get a tiny flicker shining long enough to ignite the end of his cigarette. Drawing in a lungful of the toxic fumes, Voli held it and let the smoke burn in his lungs. Fucking Russians. Voli cursed, blowing out a mouthful of white and settling accusing blue eyes on the Kremlin. Fucking Grigori. Fucking Azazel. It felt good to let the crude words roll off his tongue, even if it made some of the passerby give him odd looks. Still, maybe it was unfair of him to be mad about Azazel sending him to freeze his balls off in the Russian winter. The governor-general of the Grigori was only doing what Voli had asked him to. 8 years ago Voli had fled the abuse of his cowardly father. He'd been willing to put up with it for years because doing so let him stay by his human mother. But when his devil grandfather had told him to go leave and toughen himself up and that if he refused that his mother would die, Voli left within the hour. His mother was a kind and gentle woman and Voli knew that his father's family had surely never given a damn about her. If he didn't protect her, no one would. Fine. Fuck them. Voli had done more than survive. He thrived. The streets had made him even harder than the abuse had and Azazel had reworked him into a true steel. He was the White Dragon Emperor. He possessed divine dividing, one of the 13 gods slaying Longina sacred gears. He wasn't a weak little boy that could be pushed around by the likes of his father and grandfather anymore. 8 years ago those two had taken Voli's mother from him. Now he was going to take her back. Dropping the half-finished cigarette to the cobblestone, Voli ground it in with a boot and cast a sharp glare about for his contact. Azazel's reach was long and his information gathering ability was second to none. But Voli's devil family was the Lucifer clan, and the descendants of the original Satans hadn't survived after the Civil War by lurking about out in the open. Before he'd been sent away from home, Voli had lived in too many different human cities to count, always on the move and hiding from the new government in Gehenna. "Where the fuck are you?" Voli growled beneath his breath impatiently, darting his gaze over the pressing crowds that moved along Moscow sidewalks. "Are you lost, my foreign friend?" A red-faced short Russian man stopped beside Voli, peering up at the taller man with curious brown orbs. While he was only a half-devil, his inborn magic still rendered the rolling foreign tongue intelligible for Voli, and when he spoke back the words were transformed into the human's native tongue. "How did you know I was foreign?" The Russian gave Voli a look that suggested he was being particularly stupid. "If you were not a foreigner, you would not be standing in the street looking like a lost American puppy. Is that what it looks like to you? You do not have the Slavic look, and a Russian wouldn't walk around Moscow with an American flag patch on their back." Irritation flared in Voli's chest. No wonder everyone had been giving him strange glances. "I suppose I am the victim of an unfunny joke. It was just like Azazel to secretly alter his clothes and make him look like a fool." "Ah. If you say so. But I'll ask again, are you lost?" "No." Voli denied, attention already wandering away. "Fair enough. Don't be afraid to ask for help. There are many strange mysteries in Moscow for foreigners." Burning blue eyes snapped back. "And I suppose you know how exactly I should solve those puzzles?" Voli challenged, prompting a sly smirk to cross the other man's face. "It never hurts to ask for a little guidance. Otherwise we'll all end up below the ground. Being below the ground might not be as unpleasant as you expect." "Too true. But if it were all fun and games, that wouldn't be where we end up after falling." Voli ran a hand over his nose, frowning at the numbness the cold winter wind had given his face. "Well, you've given all the right responses, so either you're the man I need or you're a very good spy. What do you have for me, Nikolai?" "Today, I am Grisha." "Fine, Grisha, what do you have for me?" The brown-eyed man sighed, shoving his hands under his armpits and turning away. The scruff of his medium-length dark beard worked as the man swallowed, a frown drawing his thick brows tight. "Well, I was told that you might be interested in picking up a very rare breed of poodle. The one-of-a-kind companion, to be honest, since I've heard enough about you to know that she'd be the perfect old girl for you. Every man has that special one." "Exactly. I'm quite interested." Grisha drew in a sharp breath. "Unfortunately, my friend, it won't be possible for me to help her find a new home. Her previous owners were so awful that she couldn't live like that. I'm sorry. She's in a better place now." "What? What?" It was like the whole world had gone soundless and grey. He could still see the annoyed pushing of passerby, the faint midwinter sunlight glinting off snow, and the wet gleam of slush-covered cobblestone. But there was no color or life anywhere in it. Voli didn't know what he said to Grisha to dismiss Azazel's middleman. He just knew that after the man left, he stood alone in the Russian capital and let hot salty streams run down his cheeks. "Mother." Naruto supposed he should have expected the sudden challenge. Years of whispers about his apparent superiority had a way of taking their toll, and despite the friendly smile curving Ria's lips, Naruto could easily feel the bite from her gaze. "Alright." The Redeed boy exhaled slowly, unbuttoning the collar of his white dress shirt. "Let's rock." Naruto could either accept the mock duel and have to raise his hand to the girl he'd come to view as his sister, or he'd refuse and leave everyone with the suspicion he'd done it out of arrogance. That was no choice at all. The only thing left to do was fight. "Where do you want it?" A slight flash of hesitation crossed Ria's face before it hardened into determination. She might feel a little guilty about fighting her nephew, and when she beat him, she'd likely feel even worse. But she needed to silence the constant mutters among the servants that she was going to end up being a poor choice for heir. "I think the dueling arena should suffice. It's nothing so formal, but we wouldn't want to break any furniture." Shrugging one shoulder, Naruto stepped past his much taller pseudo-sister. "Let's hurry it up then, Rias. I don't want to make a scene or anything." Under the facade of nonchalance, the younger devil really didn't. Either he'd beat Rias and end up shaming her in front of a bunch of witnesses, or she'd beat him, and then his mother would kick both their asses for such uncouth behavior, so it was best to go without others watching altogether. The pair of devils quickly moved to the small dueling arena that squatted in the corner of the estate the Gremory main house currently resided in. The building itself was squat and rectangular, simple lines and pure utility. There were no grand seats set aside for huge crowds or overhanging balconies for a decadent emperor. No statue of a pagan god or an ancient statesman marred the stone walls. The sand of the arena itself was bounded by a simple fence that divided the fighting stage from a single-file walkway where observers could stand. Rias strode to one corner of the sandy square, turquoise eyes watching as Naruto took the other. His child's form looked even smaller when set against the tall posts of the fence, and sudden shame filled the ruined princess's gut. Was she so afraid of rumors and snide comments that she'd stoop to committing violence against her own nephew? Nothing lethal. She stated, voice small with the weight of guilt. Of course. Naruto agreed instantly, squatting slightly and taking in the side of his aunt. The teen devil stood straight-backed with her arms folded under her chest. A poor stance for a shinobi, but to be fair, typical magicians rarely worried about agility or what would happen if they were suddenly tackled. On three. On three. 3, 2, 1, go. Naruto instantly barreled to the side, short legs working furiously to propel his tiny body across the pale sand. Dirt bounced off his back as Ria's enormous balls of Bale clan sorcery bit into the ground behind him. Her spells were powerful, and if she managed to catch him, she might even knock him out of the fight with a single hit. But they were slow and easy enough to avoid if he kept moving along. Summoning up his own red spell in response, Naruto spun on his heel and swiftly elongated the sphere into the sharp shape of an arrow. The red-haired boy launched the projectile, piercing through Ria's larger swell of magic and causing an explosive detonation. Almost reluctantly, a smile of excitement split his lips. It might be only practice, but it had been so long since Naruto had experienced anything like a real fight. Rias bit her lip as her hair was thrown into disarray. Wind and dirt blown about by the force of clashing magic made the teen devil reconsider her strikes. The larger spheres were certainly powerful, even after she'd hollowed them out from the distinctive Bale destruction and left only crimson-colored concussive force, but Naruto was blowing them away with ease. Each arrow split her spells before they could even cross half the arena. Well, if they weren't moving fast enough, then she would simply decrease the size and increase the spread. Rias began to split her larger balls of sorcery into smaller spheres, multiplying the number of her strikes and increasing the pace at which they moved. The arcs of vermilion magic began to corral her nephew, chasing his agile movements into a corner and forcing him to summon up a shield. Peering through the glowing runic circle of his conjured shield, Naruto began to count the volleys. They came vicious and strong, but they came in a pattern and the red-haired boy could see it. 3 swift hammerings and then a pause for Rias to reload. Naruto moved forward, ducking under a spray of fist-sized balls and lashing out with a long punishing whip. The bright saffron curve swung in a cruel horizontal arc, bifurcating the entire arena and causing Rias to throw herself to the dirt to roll under it. Not bad. The ruined princess admitted, climbing back to her feet with a frown. That sort of elongating strike wasn't something she'd have thought of herself, but it put her in mind of her brother. Zeoticus had a way of cutting everyone and everything down to size. Maybe she should start doing the same. Calling a glowing handful of the power of destruction to her palms, Rias pulled the bright red sparkles out into the shape of a whip. A little concentration of might enflamed the ghostly construct, adding force and power to its transparent form. The fight might be just a little rougher than she'd originally expected, but Rias wasn't going to lose. Naruto was always the genius. He always managed to pull off a feat and leave the whole clan cooing around him. Rias had been 10 years old when she'd managed to stumble through teleportation. Well, the spell looked easy enough, moving through time and space required more than a little power and skill, otherwise every peasant would have been using it. Her nephew had been 5. Half Ria's age and managing to make the exact same achievements as a devil she was. It was like Zeoticus' son had been some kind of genius from the cradle, fighting with instinct and skill years ahead of his time. "I'm not going to lose to you," she promised, watching as Naruto began to call on his own power. The gathering cloud of blood-red energy was a mirror to her own, focusing around the skin of Naruto's forearms and hands. Where Rias had converted her magic into the harsh form of a cutting whip, Naruto forced his into thick gauntlets. Bloody red mist encased the boy's fists, coating Naruto's limbs up to the elbow. The rolling surface of Naruto's magic was still transparent, and Rias wondered with a touch of amusement what he'd look like if his whole body was covered with it. He'd probably look like some tiny shounen protagonist out of one of the many Japanese manga she'd read. Shaking away the absurd image, the teen devil steeled herself for the struggle to come. She didn't want to hurt Naruto, but she wasn't going to let him defeat her either. Ready or not, she breathed more to herself than to him. "Here I come." Naruto's blue eyes tracked his aunt's movements as she leaned into the clash of sorcery. A blood-red whip of conjured demonic energy swished through the air in vicious little cracks, smashing through the rolling spheres of his magic. Rias was closing the distance slowly, stepping carefully forward towards him while wielding her makeshift magical weapon as both sword and shield. It was in its own way proof of Ria's natural genius. Naruto was pretty damn sure no one had ever trained her to use a whip as a weapon, yet after a few short swings, she was managing to make it work. Her movements were those of a clumsy amateur, and more than once Naruto saw the ruined princess flinch back when the loose movements of the ghostly strap twisted too roughly for her, but she was managing to cut down his lazy volleys of spellcraft. A dumber devil wouldn't have been able to even figure out how to make the thing move with any amount of accuracy. But if Rias was a genius, Naruto was a genius among geniuses. Or at least had 15 years or so of experience on the battlefield over her. Matching his aunt's steady creeping stride step for step, the red-haired boy started to move to close the distance. Deep blue eyes crossed with Ria's turquoise gaze more than once as their trading arcs of magical power intensified. Saffron orbs collided and cracked, splintering into a dizzying show of brightness and power, but that display was still nothing but a sideshow compared to the real avenue of their conflict. Naruto clenched his fists inside his shifting gauntlets of diabolical light, carefully measuring the shortening gap between them with his eyes. Despite the blinding clash of magic, the younger devil could still see his aunt's taller form, and he knew when to move. Perhaps it was a bit unfair, considering he'd lived a life as a shinobi, and Rias had never been anything but a somewhat pampered noble girl. While Rias was powerful for her age, she was no war-hardened combatant, and it showed in the way she reluctantly struck out at him. She second-guessed herself too much, only giving half an effort because she was afraid of hurting him. When she came at him, the whip cut too slow and too low, coming in around Naruto's hip, and it was easy pickings for the former ninja. Stepping into the incoming lash, Naruto grinned at the look of sudden astonishment on Ria's face. Then he swiftly sliced into the length of it with a sorcery-enhanced chop. The slithering string of energy broke easily beneath Naruto's hands, denying his aunt her chosen form of attack. It had really been a bad strategic choice to rely on a weapon she had little experience with to try and take him on. Cutting up a whip like this was pretty basic training for a Konoha shinobi, though he would have generally used a kunai to do it in his previous life. She would have done better to keep relying on her typical methods of casting rather than gambling on something brand new. Of course, to give Rias her dues, Naruto hardly expected that she'd have known anything about Konoha and what it taught him. Naruto clenched a fist, splitting a fraction of the rolling force shrouding his hands off. A thought rolled the wavering magical energy into tight balls, which he launched at Rias' feet. The sudden bombardment forced Rias to take a handful of stumbling steps as she hopped to avoid the volley. There was no point in dragging it out. She'd underestimated him from the beginning, and he wasn't about to let her get away with it. If she'd been in a real fight, not taking her opponent seriously might be enough to get her killed. He'd rather see her feel a little humiliated in the present than watch her get killed in the future. The quicker he could take her down, the better it would be for both of them. Sorry. Naruto apologized, dodging ahead and slipping under Ria's guard with a punishing punch. Wreathed in concussive sorcery and with all the weight of his small body behind it, the sheer force of his fist to her gut was enough to fold his aunt in half. The trail of spittle escaped Ria's mouth as she groaned, losing control over her magic and letting the last remnants of her conjured weapon fade away into a spray of motes. Stars exploded in her eyes as Naruto followed up his gut punch with an elbow to the back of the head. Rias collapsed to the sand, landing on her hands and knees with a painful crunch. Red strands of hair dragged through the dirt as Naruto leapt on her back and drove her face to the ground with a dull thump. Thin arms wrapped around her throat and the voice of her nephew growled in her ear. "You give?" Pure indignation flared through her, and Rias defiantly grabbed at Naruto's grip around her throat. Clear-coated nails scratched fruitlessly at the boy's skin, digging pink furrows that had Naruto wincing and tightening his chokehold. "Come on already." "No." Rias shrieked, digging the fingers of one hand furiously in the sand, and shake intensified her efforts to buck Naruto off her back. She would not be beaten by a child. That would simply prove the stupid whispers that she wasn't good enough, right? The dull ringing in her ears disturbed her angry attempts to grab hold of her core of magical energy. "I'm not losing to you." Nearly thrown off by the sudden fierce struggle of the older devil beneath him, Naruto grunted and heaved his weight back down. "Stop being stubborn." A bead of sweat dripped down from Naruto's temples, carving a glistening line of stress, and he squeezed in an effort to get Rias to submit. "Just give up already, I don't want to hurt you." "Fuck you." Surprised at the uncharacteristic curse, Naruto nearly missed the sudden vermilion spark as Rias found her magic once more. What had been planned to be a friendly duel was becoming something far more violent, and if he didn't get a leash on Rias soon, things might escalate too far. Rushing to his own reservoir of power, the boy fumbled and attacked in a preemptive blast. Naruto struck too hard, slamming both of them down in a dizzied heap with a smoky halo of crimson energy. Rias crashed face first in the dirt for the second time. A faint crack echoed through her ears as her face filled with hot pain. Wetness ran freely from her nostrils, soaking the sand maroon. Spitting out a wad of blood that had trickled down from her broken nose, the ruined princess reached back and tore at her dazed nephew's hair with a taloned hand. A yelp broke through the heavy air before she finally tossed him away. Rolling to a crouch, Naruto twisted at the hips before stopping with a sudden rush of guilt and horror. "Shit, Rias, I didn't mean to," he choked off, watching as his aunt took a hand to her sand and blood-covered face. Itcher smeared across the white skin of Ria's palms as she futilely attempted to stem the tide of blood dripping from her nares. Sea green eyes glared at the younger devil accusingly, twitching from time to time with unfamiliar pain when Rias prodded at the swelling skin of her face. Naruto was used to Rias looking a little jealous whenever he managed to cross a milestone in training at a younger age than she had, but he was shocked by the sudden boiling venom in his pseudo-sister's gaze. What is going on here? Graphia's voice cut through the tense silence with all the force of a drill sergeant. Both young devils flinched, turning their attention to the approaching form of Naruto's mother. A pair of servants trailed at the queen's heels, the three of them forming a matching trio of maid outfits. Typically, Naruto's mother was an ocean of calm amidst the more energetic storms in their family, her silver hair and silver eyes, a gentle break in the crowd of red hair and blue-green eyes. If Naruto had to describe the harsh expression of his mother's face now, he certainly wouldn't have used calm. Ah, shit. The feather dropped, ash gray with each filament thrown into sharp relief before Sasuke's training vision. Pound you. Lightning exploded from Sasuke's skin, the cold white light illuminating the forest canopy, even as the Uchiha scrambled to his feet. Familiar chirping filled the air, and in that moment, it was the most beautiful sound Sasuke had ever heard. Baring his teeth in a beastly snarl, Sasuke threw himself into the fight. Anxiety and the shame at his own weakness fell away, and everything he had in him was united in one purpose. Survival. With his heart hammering like a jackrabbit, the Uchiha lunged. Chidori. Dona sighed and held his hand out. Cool blue light exploded from the middle-aged fallen angel's palm. The spear of light stretched and solidified into an elegant half-pike. A lighter baby blue seemed to shimmer along the bladed edge, trailing faint streamers through the air as Dona twirled the conjured weapon and brought it up to parry away Sasuke's desperate attack. Come on boy. Show me how much you want to live. Sasuke struck again, fist covered in wild screeching electricity. Swaying away from the blow, the fallen angel clicked his tongue and brought his boot up in a half-hearted kick. A crack echoed through the clearing as the right side of Sasuke's chest caved in beneath the blow. Wrinkles deepened on the fallen angel's face as Sasuke dropped to a knee, coughing blood and struggling to breathe. Too much force. Dona mused, delivering a burning slap to the young devil with a lazy swing of his spear. The fallen angel hardly considered himself a member of the Grigori's top echelons, but just because he'd never risen high in the fallen angel military government didn't make him weak. He'd survived the great war against the devils and angels after all. Sometimes he forgot his own strength. Pain flared with every breath as Sasuke heaved back to his feet. Blood coated the back of the Uchiha's tongue, and his Chidori flickered weakly as he leapt backwards to open some distance between his wounded form and the predator frowning at him. No. The fallen angel reversed his opinion after a moment filled with Sasuke's quiet coughs. It's not a matter of using too much force. You're simply too weak. Dona moved faster than Sasuke's eyes could perceive. One moment the fallen angel was across the clearing, and the next stars were exploding in Sasuke's vision as the hilt of Dona's spear clobbered into his temple. The Chidori died entirely as Sasuke was swept off his feet. Rolling desperately, Sasuke spit out a wad of blood and crawled painfully back upright. Cold blue eyes pierced the Uchiha's shaking form, disapproval written in the contemptuous curve of the fallen angel's lips. Would you run away like a frightened rabbit again? Dark feathers swirled as the fallen angel began to slowly move forward, each step triggering Sasuke to move back. You've seen the difference in our strength, you know that distance is useless, but still you're cowering back. Leather gloves creaked as Dona's fist tightened around his spear of heart and light. This is why you low-level creatures are such a nuisance. You have no pride. You can't even give a good fight. Each word needled in Sasuke like hot brands, stinging his pride and stoking his anger. But the fallen angel wasn't wrong. 10 years a devil and Sasuke was still too weak. All the quiet pride in his successes seemed self-aggrandizing. Those years spent beating Taijutsu into his unconditioned body seemed a waste. Every painful hour given up to force his weak magical reserves into reproducing the Chidori were worthless. Closing the distance in a blur of dark feathers, Dona delivered more bruising strikes from the flat of his blade to the wounded Uchiha. Every slap was a humiliation that seared metaphorically and literally. What are you doing, brat? The whistling hammer to Sasuke's kneecap. This is pathetic. A burning slice along the meat of his forearm. How many years have you spent as a devil, only managing to achieve this? A bone-crushing slam to the Uchiha's bleeding foot. Why are you so weak? Lightning sparked weakly in Sasuke's palm as he made a desperate claw at Dona's eyes. The fallen angel backhanded the Chidori away with a snort before giving Sasuke a punishing axe kick to the torso. The broken bones of Sasuke's ribsage ground sickeningly together as the young devil dropped back to his knees with a groan of pain. There was a queer sensation of ripping inside of him, and with a final gasp Sasuke began vomiting blood into the cradle of his lap. Dona gave an annoyed click of the tongue at the display. Bringing his spear of light up against the devil's cheek, the fallen angel pressed the sharp edge of the blade in just enough for it to open the skin over Sasuke's cheekbone. Blood ran unnoticed in a thin rivulet down the pale skin of Sasuke's face to mingle with the bruises and smeared blood over the rest of his body. It was a bubbling and burning of his flesh, reacting to angel light magic, that made Sasuke drag his weary black orbs up to meet Donaseek's pitiless blue glare. Even in the face of death there was still resignation in the Uchiha's eyes, the resignation of a man with a duty, but very little actual passion. "You know the answer as well as I do, boy," Donaseek declared, pulling the spear just enough to open more of Sasuke's cheek without decapitating him. "You've just been fooled into refusing to see it. Perhaps some idealist got to you and encouraged you to abandon some hard-won truth. An empty vessel like you are now, how could you be anything but a failure? Open your eyes. You're weak. Why are you weak?" A cruel sneer worked its way onto the craggy planes of the fallen angel's face. "Because you lack hatred." The change between one heartbeat and the next made Donaseek's heart begin to truly feel a thrill for the first time since the night began. Dull resignation was burnt up in an instant, eaten away by instinctive black rage. "Shut up." Exploded from the teenage devil, droplets of blood spewing out with each denying roar. "Shut up, shut up, shut up, shut up, shut up, shut up." A Chidori shrieked back into existence, chirping brighter and burning fiercer than anything Donaseek had seen from the boy since the chase began. Sasuke slammed his lightning-coated hand into the fallen angel's spear, light and electricity, screaming for dominance and mingling into a hot blue radiance. Vibrations trembled up the length of the half-pike, twitching the conjured weapon violently until Donaseek pulled back with a breathless chuckle. "That's it, boy. Show me." The fallen angel taunted, spurring the devil into a frothing rage as he bobbed and wove just out of reach. The blue spear of light hammered against Sasuke's Chidori again and again, each collision forcing spiderweb cracks through the conjuration's glassy surface. "What kind of power is your anger giving you? How much stronger are you when fueled by hatred?" This fallen angel was saying all the things Itachi had once said to goad Sasuke down the path of revenge. Just where did Donaseek get off sounding like a B-tier villain version of his brother? What kind of divine mockery was this supposed to be? Just a last fuck you for Sasuke in his last hour in this fucked up second life. "Shut up." Burst from Sasuke's lips with a spray of blood, and the Chidori coating his hand surged even brighter. "I'll kill you," he vowed in the midst of bloodlust and rage, before slamming the lightning magic against Donaseek's spear in a blow that destroyed the conjured weapon with a tinkle of shattering crystal. Donaseek leapt back, leaving stutter. The fallen angel appraised, voice gone entirely neutral. There was no mocking in that face. No emotion. Just pure efficiency. The battle-loving maniac was gone. The arrogance had all drained away. There was no contrived hunt any longer. Now it's time to end this. If Sasuke had thought Donaseek was swift before, that speed was nothing compared to their true difference in ability. The Uchiha didn't even have time to register anything but the sudden explosion of pain that shredded his heart. There was no dramatic conjuration. No flow of dark feathers and movement. Just the sensation of pain when a spear of enchanted light suddenly appeared in his flesh. Sasuke hadn't even been able to comprehend it until the conjured weapon was fully lodged inside of him and cooking his internal organs away with holy light. "Goodbye, boy." Crumbling to the ground in a splatter of mud, Sasuke tried to draw in a breath. He tried to reach an arm up to pull the deadly spear from his flesh. He tried to curse at the futility of it all. All he achieved was a tiny scrabble of his nails in the forest loam as darkness rapidly rushed in from the corners of his vision. There was no frantic hammering of the heart or slowly stuttering beat. There was nothing at all because Sasuke's heart was gone. "I'm dying." Shit. Dark streamers strangled all the colors out of his vision. The last thing he felt before his senses failed was a slick lukewarm sensation of sinking slightly into a patch of mud created from the mingling of soil and his own blood. "Do you want to live?" Her haughty tone was familiar. It was almost fitting that the only companion he'd made in the new world would be the last thing conjured up by his dying brain. She might as well be asking for cookies. "Do you want power?" The void yawned, endless oblivion hungered. "Yes. I have never been so ashamed of either of you." In a way, the quiet disappointment in his mother's voice was worse than if she'd had a loud screaming fit. Naruto chewed the inside of his cheek, sneaking a glance at his aunt out of the corner of his eye. Magic had healed her broken nose and chased away the swelling and bruising, but the memories of those injuries was still there. Injuries that he'd given her because he'd come at her too roughly and treated her as more skilled than she was. He could still summon the image of her toxic teal stare when he closed his eyes, and combined with the heavy steel glare Graphia was giving the pair of them, Naruto felt sick to his stomach. "I thought I'd raised you both better than that." Graphia sighed, folding her arms over her chest. She'd dismissed the crowd of servants and healed Ria's nose herself, but that wouldn't stop the talk that was going to come out of the little scuffle. "I did my best to teach you to think before you acted. But instead of taking whatever dispute you had to Suitors or Zeoticus to solve, you scrabbled it out like a pair of low-born commoners in the dirt." "We weren't brawling." Rias disputed, a rebellious fey look in her eyes. The angry clench of her jaw worried Naruto. "We were having an informal duel." It was nothing to disturb the household over. Rafia's brows drew sharply together as Naruto's mother pressed her lips together. That doesn't make it any better. A duel is not a game. What if one of you had managed to do serious damage to the other? You're much older than he is, and Naruto is. Much stronger than I am. Ice filled Ria's voice, making Naruto wince and look for someone to say to diffuse all the tension. The nails of Ria's clenched fists bit into her palms. Is that what you mean to say? The strongest queen hesitated, spurring Rias to roll her eyes spitefully. Whatever then, I'm done with this. The red-haired girl shoved on past her sister-in-law, ignoring the woman's demands for her to come back. Just leave it, mom. Naruto sighed, rubbing a hand over his forehead. What a fucking mess. This is more my fault than hers. I'm the one you should be mad at. Most of the time Naruto was willing to take the heat for people he cared about. That he'd broken Ria's face half an hour ago only made him more determined to take the punishment. It was his way of making amends. Bitterness twisted Grafia's lips as the silver-haired devil stared down the corridor her sister-in-law had stomped through. You're not as good a liar as you think you are, Naruto. Naruto frowned at his mother's back, stepping up beside her and shoving his hands in his pockets. I don't see how it's not my fault. The 10-year-old grunted, looking up with steely blue eyes. I was the one that decided it was best to get it out of the way now, without anyone knowing about it. Neither of us was gonna seriously hurt the other, but Rias needed that fight. It's not easy growing up with someone younger than you that everyone loves to call a genius. A queer expression crossed the taller devil's face as she finally turned to stare down at her son. Sometimes I wonder about you. When your father is around you can act like quite the fool, but when he's not you can act surprisingly mature. If I didn't know better I'd think you were much older than you actually are. I can act the fool all the time if you like. How do you feel about mud under the sheets at the foot of your bed? Do you want to die? Ouch, mom. You're gonna make me cry. The unladylike snort escaped her, lips twitching in reluctant amusement. Haven't you heard? I take sustenance from the sorrow and tears of others. Grafia settled a hand over Naruto's shoulder, humor falling away. Well, I understand what you tried to do, you may have actually made it worse. Wincing, Naruto scratched the back of his head. Yeah, I know. An official duel presided over by one of his parents or grandparents would have been recorded in public record and they'd need a few witnesses on hand to make sure things didn't get out of control. But they could have controlled the narrative a little better. Instead, his effort to keep it all secret meant then when his mother and maids walked in, it was to the side of him beating the stuffing out of Rias. What would have been called a mere victory instead would get called an utter massacre. Your grandfather may not have any choice in the matter after this. The news spread like wildfire. Leaping from mouth to mouth, household to household, clan to clan. Naruto Gremory had viciously beaten Rias Gremory in a duel, and because of that victory, he was to be named the heir to the clan. The 10-year-old himself denied that the victory was as one-sided and violent as they implied, but his protests were lost in the wind of gossip. As for Akeno, she was a little busy packing away a pair of socks to listen to the latest burbles of speculation. A grim frown pulled at the queen's lips when she followed the black knee socks with a pair of red lace panties. At a different time she might have been a little amused at the outright sexuality of her underwear, she came by it honestly through her mother, but Akeno was a little too consumed with worry. With Naruto confirmed as heir a few days ago, Ria's tiny peerage had kept their heads down. While Devil society was more gender equal than medieval human ones, considering that women could attain equal magical power, it was still to a degree patriarchal. The gender imbalance after the Great War that left pureblood nobles on the verge of extinction only further decreased their independence. Without the protection of the heir position, the ruined princess was suddenly much more vulnerable to politics within the aristocracy. The clan would refuse to sell their heir's hand cheaply, but Rias was just a spare now. Her only remaining political value was in her bloodline and the womb that would pass it on. It was probably too early to be worried about threats of engagement, and the Gremory clan was a little more soft-hearted than most, but they were still a clan. Rias, Akeno, and even Keko hadn't wanted to cause too much fuss and give anyone any ideas about getting rid of a troublesome former heir presumptive. So they'd leave. Out of sight and out of mind. Centuries ago the previous Duke Gremory had an arranged marriage with a noblewoman from the Balam clan. Rather than do something as politically unwise as elope with his lover, the devil had simply taken many concubines. For his favorite concubine, he'd built Starling Hall. It was a relatively remote estate, constructed for a single woman and her children, and perfect for Ria's peerage. Like any other home made for the nobility, it sprawled, but it lacked the sheer vastness the aristocrats traditionally favored. Rias was partial to it because of the exquisitely constructed observatory it housed. A single vacation there as a girl and the ruined princess was hooked on what she called her star chamber. Akeno would just be happy to get out of the estate the rest of Ria's immediate family was currently living in. She was hardly a therapist, but she hoped the distance from the hovering servants and visiting clansmen would take some of the conflict out of her friend's heart. It was difficult to watch Rias alternatively mope around and seethe with envy. It was not a good look for someone she knew was usually tender-hearted. Stuffing a box of earrings into one of her suitcases, Akeno gave her room a last cursory look over. There were a few potted plants and old books she'd collected over the years scattered over the shelves, but nothing really stuck out at her. While Akeno might look like a high-maintenance woman that needed to be spoiled, she wasn't attached to material things. Living on the streets for a year and a half made her more focused on utility than luxury. A few pieces of her mother's jewelry were probably the only things she owned that she considered irreplaceable, and those were carefully tucked away already. Seems fine to me, she decided, waving a hand over her luggage and casting a levitation spell with a swirl of yellow runes. The suitcases rose into the air and floated along after her as Akeno left her bedroom and stalked through the corridors. Keko was likely already waiting in Ria's bedroom, and once Akeno got there they could teleport away like thieves in the night. The image made her chuckle grimly. Stopping 3 doors down from her own room, Akeno knocked and let herself in. Slow. Keko greeted from the bed, the Nekomata curled up with her knees to her chest. Pulling down an eyelid, Akeno stuck her tongue out at the younger girl. Bleh. Not everyone lives out of a cat basket. Some people actually have to pack some of their favorite bed sheets. Behave, or I won't get you any more wind-up mice. The Nekomata just shot back an irritated glare. Where's Rias? Saying goodbye. Akeno made a wordless noise of sympathy. They weren't moving out really. For powerful devils like Ria's family, teleporting over to see her anytime they wanted was child's play, and they'd just be lodging in another one of the Gremory clan's many properties. But even Zeoticus still lived under the same roof, despite being a centuries-old Satan and lord of the slowly rebuilding Lucifer clan territory. For such a close-knit family, a teleportation circle away was both right next door and another country. She wondered if her human Himejima cousins were just as tightly bound, or if they could cut ties with each other, just like they'd cut ties with her. Good, you're here. Rias muttered as she slipped into the room. Faint dark circles lined under her turquoise eyes, and not for the first time Akeno wished that her friend wasn't hiding away from the family that wanted to help her. The half-breed wasn't enough of a hypocrite to nag at Rias, considering she abandoned her concerned absentee father, but up and leaving might not be the best choice. It wasn't like her parents weren't willing to understand their daughter's emotional turmoil. They'd certainly let her leave to find herself and have her own space with little enough protest after extracting promises to visit and tell them if she ever needed to talk. Instead of leaning on her family, Rias was retreating from everything that had purposefully or accidentally caused her pain. Almost all staff at Starling Hall had been let go prior to Rias deciding to move there, so besides the odd visiting cleaner, it would be practically empty. The mistress and 2 members of a peerage did not a village make, and there would be no clansmen nosing into their training progress or servants gushing over Little Master Naruto. But Rias was not built for solitude, and Akeno worried about the long-term impact of her self-imposed isolation. Are you ready to go? Rias prodded tiredly, waving a hand and creating a small teleportation circle in the corner of the bedroom. The ruined princess's luggage floated over to linger by the red runes. If not, now's the time to speak up. Of course. Yes. Then let's not waste any more time. Watching the tail end of one of Office's thick black snakes slither down the dying Uchiha's throat with vague interest, Dona turned and doffed his fedora in welcome. Your script was excellent, Oju-sama. The Ouroboros dragon stared at the fallen angel with dull grey eyes before giving a minuscule nod. Cupping her dainty hands, the Gothic Lolita reached through the fabric of reality and into the dimensional gap that lurked between worlds with a sparkle of blinding lurid rainbow light. Dona blinked away the watery stinging in his eyes, only to have a blue gauntlet shoved into his gloved hands with all the fanfare of a bag of human fast food. As agreed. Office intoned, swiveling back to face Sasuke's twitching body. Destroying the spear of light pinning the devil to the ground with a thought, the dragon god stretched out her hand and healed every wound marking Sasuke's flesh. Hovering uncertainly, the fallen angel slid the azure twice critical over his left hand. Even if you heal his wounds, Lady Office, the boy may not survive the infusion of your power. Dona clenched his fist to test the fit of the sacred gear. The magical artifacts constructed by the god of the Bible were typically hidden in the souls of humans at birth, but enterprising non-humans had ways of extracting them from their original owners. Twice critical might be one of the more common sacred gears, but the ability to double his strength was nothing to sneeze at. Betting his hands on the artifact was why he'd taken part in Office's little performance in the first place. Dona looked back up at the dragon god and frowned. Well, it's not truly any of my business. Why did you not simply nurture the boy with drops of power? Why contract me to take part in this charade? For a long beat, the Ouroboros dragon appeared to ignore the query. Dona was not wrong. Waiting 10 years only to end the decade with a traumatizing lie appeared needlessly complex and pointless. Especially when Office could have merely given Sasuke power during their first meeting. But the concern was not merely ability. A tool with no spirit, remaining apathetically inside his boundaries and growing only when forced to suckle from the teat of power, an existence like that is of no use to me. Sasuke needed to suffer. He needed to experience a long run of futility to teach him the weakness of the purpose Uzumaki Naruto had tried to give him. When compounded on the last years of his first life, Uchiha Sasuke had spent 15 years as an ascetic wanderer who wanted nothing for himself. There was no passion in a man like that. He was content to waste away achieving little and justifying it with half-hearted idealistic rationalizations and bleating about duty. A weak man like that could never become the soldier Office needed him to be. Great Red was not something that could be destroyed with lackadaisical effort. If Sasuke was going to help her destroy the dragon of dragons that had taken over the dimensional gap, he needed to be more than he was. The Office shared the title of the strongest existence with Great Red, and only a truly powerful warrior would be able to do damage to the Apocalypse Dragon. I see. Dona murmured, brushing a thumb over his new sacred gear. You intend to break him into pieces and reforge him into a devil with desires of his own. I wish you the best of luck in your endeavor then, Ouroboros Dragon. Business has been a pleasure. You know how to contact me if you wish to work together in the future. Dark wings unfurled from the fallen angel's back, slipping out of the dimensional pocket they were typically concealed in, and hoisting the middle-aged man into the air with a lazy sweep. The baby blue twice critical disappeared beneath the sleeves of Donaseek's trench coat and he turned to leave. A word of advice, Lady Office. This boy may be a pure-blooded devil, but there is more similarity between humans and devils than either would like to admit. Do not make the mistake of thinking a single defeat will be enough to crush his heart and make him into something else. He will bounce back. Watching the fallen angel float away in a swirl of ash-gray feathers with a blank expression, Office began to change. The facade of innocent prepubescent black-haired girl fell away, and the dragon god grew taller by the breath, bosom swelling and hips widening, until she stood in the body of an adult woman. You underestimate me, Donaseek of the Grigori. I understand how you mortal beings behave better than you think. The Office knelt beside Sasuke's pale face, brushing a hand over his emaciated chest. The ghostly snake inside the Uchiha twitched, letting out just a little more power and driving Sasuke to inflate his newly healed lungs with a stuttering gasp. His regenerated heart contracted weakly, forcing blood through Sasuke's veins, even as his flesh began to crumble away once more. The Ouroboros dragon had the ability to distill her own essence. Conjured in the form of shimmering black snakes, the creatures would then sink their fangs into whatever being had gained her attention. Office's venom was a double-edged sword, unlocking some of the potential of the one bitten, even as it risked killing them outright. What Office had given Sasuke was more than a single bite. It was a constant link between her and him, sinking more and more venom into his veins when she desired it. Yet even that first bite from the snake she'd given him seemed to be too much. Sasuke was dying beneath the weight of a fraction of his own potential. Blackened veins bruised the Uchiha's skin like a curse, splitting open the pale surface and leaking dark ichor. Sweat beaded along Sasuke's brow as he took another shaky breath, mind lost to nightmares of a distant chill void. Perhaps Office had made his body too weak when she summoned him across dimensions. Even with her healing and the carefully cultivated beginning of a will to power, Sasuke would die. How unfortunate. It had been a gamble in the end to hope that Uchiha Sasuke and Uzumaki Naruto would be fitting weapons. At least the Cow's Brigade plan was moving forward. Smoothing the black satin of her dress over her knees, Office rose and tore a hole between worlds with a snap of her fingers. Events were not moving quickly enough in the Adoloka for her liking. Words would need to be had with a descendant of Sun Wukong, otherwise Bhikkhu would just continue to procrastinate. I like cookies. Then take them. Office stopped on the threshold, giving Sasuke a last look. Midnight liquid seeped from the corners of his closed eyelids, ran from his aristocratic nose, dribbled out of the corner of his lips, and dripped from his ears. The Uchiha's skin split even more beneath the force of the venom in his veins, driving him to cry out in agony. Sentiment. Driving her fang through her pink tongue, Office stood in silence as her mouth filled with the copper taste of her own blood. A droplet of crimson slipped between her pale lips, tracing an obscene red line down the ivory skin of the dragon god's chin. Office dropped back to her knees, grass rustling as she reached out to cradle the young devil's face. Ignoring the clammy sensation of sweat and ichor beneath her fingertips, the Ouroboros dragon pressed her lips to his, decision made. Blood ran hot and slick from her mouth into his, sliding down Sasuke's throat like streaks of fire. If the Uchiha was too weak to survive the night, Office would simply repaint him in her own colors. The king piece twirled between Surzich's fingers idly, clear as glass and glowing with a sinister red light. One of only 9 king pieces in existence, the banned evil piece seemed to beckon like a seductress. It was almost like a whisper just out of range of hearing, begging the great Satan to bond with it and attain godlike might. Zeoticus wondered how the original champions of the raiding games had been able to give them up, considering how addictive they were. Only once had the crimson-haired Satan Lucifer used the king piece. In the closing days of the civil war that would determine the future of their kind, Zeoticus had consumed the crimson chess piece and used its power to obliterate 3 of the 72 pillars of the underworld and then almost died himself. Sometimes he still missed that rush. Yet Roigun Befelger had given hers up with nary a complaint. She'd taken her peerage almost to the top of the gladiatorial raiding games, riding high on the power of a full set of evil pieces. And then as soon as the government had banned them, she'd handed over the overwhelmingly powerful chess piece. That kind of fortitude was strength Zeoticus could admire, especially when Roigun had managed to remain in second place in the raiding games even after losing her king piece. Ajuka had done his work well when he'd created the evil pieces. Too well, if Zeoticus were honest. The ability to exponentially increase a devil's strength 100 times over was something thousands of devils would and did kill for. The chaos and blood created by the mere existence of the king pieces had triggered another military campaign in a realm tired of war to force their owners to give them up to the government. They were too dangerous to leave in the hands of the public and were seized and then assigned to trustworthy custodians. The 4 Satans, the Great King Baal, Archduke Ageres, Mephistopheles, and the raiding game champion Dihauser Belial. Only the 9th king piece remained at large within the hands of the old Satan faction if the situation remained unchanged since Graphia's defection. It worried Zeoticus to have such a catalyst for conflict unaccounted for, especially with a peace treaty between the angels, fallen angels, and devils creeping slowly towards finally being signed. Turn that frown upside down, Zeoticus chan. Seraphol Leviathan glomped the red-haired Satan, gently bonking his nose with her Mahu Shaoja wand. Why the Luong face? The corners of Zeoticus' lips curved up, easing the expression of worry that had been marring his features into something more genial. Just thinking about old times, Leviathan. Nothing to worry about. Ajuka Beelzebub made a disbelieving scoff, pulling the king piece from Zeoticus' limp fingers as he breezed past. The Satan and scientist watched the blue shine the piece took as it changed hands with an expression of faint contempt before tossing it back to its custodian. If I had known the trouble that would come from it, I wouldn't have bothered creating them. Don't lie. Falbium Asmodeus muttered, stretching lethargically over the arm of his ottoman. The slightly worn bench looked more than a touch out of place compared to the gaudy opulence of the Glacial Ebola's family's study, but none in the family had the real guts to go against the preferences of their wayward scion. Being appointed Satan had a way of encouraging people to do whatever they could to kiss ass. You love tinkering too much. You'd make them just to look at them, even if they're not useful for anything. TCH. Please don't fight. Fighting makes Leviathan sad. A stifling aura filled the air as a sinister light began to glow in the female Satan's eyes. And you don't want to make Leviathan sad, nah? Irk. Zeoticus ruffled Seraphol's hair, smiling beatifically at the pout she gave when her hat was knocked askew. We can play whack-a-devil another time. Some developments have come up. Azazel. Folding her arms over her chest, the Leviathan perched on the nearest desk with a frown. All geniality fell from the faces in the room and the crimson Satan dropped into the chair beside Ajuka with a sigh. Michael wants us to meet with him again. Zeoticus announced wearily. He's hoping that if he comes along as well with his own entourage, that the united front will inspire Azazel to stop prevaricating. If he won't listen to us, then things could get messy. Falbium cursed beneath his breath, running a hand over the shaved surface of his skull. The fuck are the Grigori doing? Letting Kekabiel run wild in the human world? Do they want another war? We could take care of it ourselves. Ajuka murmured into the worried silence. We could put that mad dog down if Azazel can't be bothered to put a leash on him. Even if we were discovered, I'm sure Michael would back us. The diplomatic repercussions would be serious, but not even the stupidest warmonger in the Grigori is going to declare war on both us and heaven. Zeoticus actually considered it for a moment. What was a single life compared to the continuation of peace? Kekabiel was clinging to the old ways and would continue to be a thorn in the side of any treaty effort. And if needed for the peace, Ajuka was right, the Archangel would back them. Contrary to human expectation, the angels and the devils had a better relationship than either had with the fallen angels. The fallen angels represented the threat of corruption to the former and a competitor for resources to the latter. Pinching the bridge of his nose, Zeoticus sighed in frustration. It's an option. We need to rely on diplomacy first, otherwise we could end up in a cold war with the fallen angels. There's also the possibility that they might take revenge by leaking the thing to other factions. The thing was such a quaint name for the horrifying truth. That the god of the Bible was dead and their 3 peoples were near to the edge of extinction. Are the Grigori that crazy? Seraphol worried her lip. It wouldn't be any better for them than it would be for us. Never underestimate how far a man will go for revenge. Ejuka interjected dryly, threading his fingers in his lap. If pushed to it, yes, I could see the Grigori spilling the beans. They're the weakest faction, and against a union of hell and heaven they'd be facing swift annihilation otherwise. Falbium eyed the clock with a vague expression of impatience. Despite being a Satan, he had a temperament ill-suited to the long boring hours required for effective governing. So we're agreed then. Diplomacy first. Diplomacy first. The Crimson Satan agreed, favoring his friends with a reassuring smile. I'll speak to Michael. Things are not lost yet. Get out. Get out, get out, get out and stay out. Ravel Phoenix shrieked, calling up fireball after fireball and aiming for Leo Person's back. The 12-year-old boy squealed as he fled the force of her fury, the bald patch she'd seared into the back of his head throbbing red. Panting as yet another would-be suitor got out of her hair, the blonde girl swiped at her forehead with the back of her hand. Idiots, the lot of them. Ravel grumbled, straightening the pink folds of her dress before turning back to her books. On the one hand, Ravel couldn't say she was surprised she had so many suitors. She was the only granddaughter of the Marquis Phoenix, and her clan was the only one that could produce the fabled Phoenix tears. Selling the cure for almost any wound or severed limb in a bottle had a way of lining their pockets with gold. But was it too much to ask that any of the dozens of noble devil boys sent to try and win her heart when she was still young have something in their veins? They were all the same. Boring, stuffy, and average in any way that mattered. Ravel deserved better than a trail of suitors so forgettable she eventually was reduced to remembered them as the brunette one or the one who wore makeup. The 8-year-old genius gave a final huff, tugging at one of her drill-shaped pigtails before cracking open the nearest book. Imbuement is the art of infusing magical energy into an already extant object. It is short-lived and thus has few applications beyond combat, however. Another one bites the dust. Riser Phoenix strode into the small library, smirking roguishly as his younger sister instantly set aside the tome she'd just opened. The blonde girl might enjoy studying, but she adored her older brother. The playboy was the only one in their family that really understood her, letting her try out spells that her parents would fret were too complex for a girl her age. Of course. Ravel turned her nose up, folding her arms over her chest. What did Mama and Papa expect? He was exactly like the one who wore gloves, always talking about money. He's lucky I didn't do worse. Running a hand through his blonde straw, Riser chuckled and pulled out a cigarette. Lighting the human cancer stick with a flash of fire from his fingertip, Riser took a long drag. By the time you're 20 you're going to have a mile-long list of brats you put the boot to. We're just lucky the person kid was from a branch of the family rather than in the main house, otherwise we'd have to listen to some bitching for a few days. Ravel wrinkled her nose. Yeah, I guess. I still remember how they wouldn't stop harping on for a week after I burnt the pants off the one with the mole on his chin. I don't know how you expect people to believe that your greatest dream is to fall in love. I'm thinking you're less Love Kitten and more Black Widow. Riser teased lightly, blowing a ring of smoke at his younger sister. Though they were both devils and thus immune to the toxins that would harm humans, it still annoyed the hell out of Ravel. That's a disgusting habit. Nah, the girls love it. Sure they do, you turkey. Isaiah howled. Generally the 10-year-old bit down on the pain to not give that sadistic bastard Valper the satisfaction of hearing him scream. But sometimes the agony got to him and it obliterated every thought behind his gray eyes that wasn't related to his suffering. Liquefied light element clouded the IV solution suspended over him, dripping through a plastic tube and through a needle to sear through the blonde's veins. Fucking Galilei. The boy roared, thrashing against his restraints as the gray-haired sadist chuckled. The priest seemed to get off on causing pain to all the church orphans that had been placed under his tender care and never made any effort to reduce their suffering, even when he could do so without impacting the experiment. That cruelty was what had gotten him named the Archbishop of Genocide and what had driven the church to excommunicate him and cut him off from their support. Unfortunately for the captive children, there were many factions in the world that were able and willing to pay Valper to play around with their insides in exchange for his discoveries. If Isaiah had to guess based on the savannah he managed to catch rare glimpses of, the latest laboratory they'd been shifted to was somewhere in Africa. Every few months, Galilei drugged them all and moved his experiment to a new country. The Holy Sword project had become so gruesome and inhumane that the various churches moved to shut it down by force when they caught wind of it, but the fat bastard was always one step ahead and it was getting easier to move every time one of the children died under the scalpel. Valper had less chattel to move. Esther. Pollux. Kamizuki. Benel. Vladimir. Lucia. Gretel. There were so many names and faces that Isaiah had met ever since Galilei had made him a prisoner. Names of fellow orphans and kidnapped children that died horrifically before being distilled into more light element. Every human had a tiny bit of it inside them, but only a few could tolerate higher levels of the substance in their bodies, and even fewer naturally had high levels of light element inside of them. Isaiah had originally had very little of it, but he tolerated the infusions better than a lot of the other kids. The less fortunate kids just ended up recycled. He wondered if it had something to do with his sacred gear that Galilei had tortured into showing itself. Sword birth was at the opposite end of the spectrum, creating demonic swords out of Isaiah's pure energy, rather than holy swords. But the excommunicated priest theorized if he was compatible with demonic sword creation, that Isaiah could be artificially prepared to wield holy swords. Fuck the holy swords. Fuck the project. Fuck Galilei and fuck dying. Isaiah didn't care how long it took. One day he was going to escape from the experiment. Isaiah wasn't going to die in the dark, another unwilling contributor to Galilei's personal amusement. He would survive. And one day, he would have revenge. Rias knew she was being childish. Carefully pruning her rose bushes was technically servant's work, but technically Rias didn't really give a damn. It gave her an excuse to keep her hands busy and not look at her hovering nephew. The boy had given her a few days of space before hopping on over for a visit, and she couldn't fuss about it since she had said her family could stop by Starling Hall whenever they wanted. Naruto was still family, and she wasn't petty enough to try and ban him from the estate. Just petty enough to avoid eye contact and give him a touch of the cold shoulder. You've got a lot of different colored ones. I thought the blue ones didn't actually exist. Naruto questioned awkwardly, folding his hands behind his back and examining the bright blue roses with too much interest to be genuine. Or did you just magic them to look like that? Yes and no. Ria smiled politely, snipping at a few dead stems with a pair of clippers. You're correct in that this color doesn't appear in nature. Typically in the human world, if you wanted blue roses you would dye them after collecting your bouquet. However, some humans are in the process of genetically modifying rose plants to show this color without needing dye. With magic, we've already managed to complete that process. Naruto reached out to run a thumb over one of the sky blue petals. It's the same with the black plants, I guess. Exactly. Though the process of engineering black roses was actually slightly easier than the blue ones. Snorting, Naruto swept a gaze over the rest of the garden. The more you know. It was a rather dizzying combination of colors that proceeded all across the rainbow. In fact, there even were a few rainbow rose plants scattered about. I'm pretty sure you can't get all the colors in one though, even with gene splicing. They are white rose plants that are enchanted to soak up dye. They don't live for long. I see. The stilted conversation trailed off, leaving unpleasant silence in its wake. Rias was content to let it stretch on. The gap between them had been slowly growing over the years, hollowing out beneath a film of normalcy. The duel had only torn through the veneer, letting all the underlying rot come to light. Naruto was better than her. So much better that looking back she could see the calculation in his movements. When they'd fought, it wasn't a struggle of near equals. He had in some nebulous way outclassed her, reducing it to a subtle lesson from one superior to one significantly inferior. Despite his youth, Naruto was better. He'd always been. It cut the ruined princess to the core. If Naruto had always been better than her, then he was always going to end up as heir to their family. And if Naruto was always going to be the heir, then Rias was never going to be. If she was never going to succeed the clan, for what reason did she exist? Was she born simply because her parents frequently had intercourse, nothing more than a symbol of love? Was Ria's entire existence merely reduced to being a reflection of the actions of those around her? A child born simply because, to provide a convenient backdrop for Naruto's greatness, and then to fade away in the shadow reduced to a convenient political prop/broodmare. Every strand of Ria's being revolted against the idea. She was more than a background piece. She was a person that was not solely defined by circumstances. Being the sister of a Satan had nothing to do with the way she wore glasses when she read to improve concentration. Her parents had nothing to do with her fascination with East Asian culture. Her nephew had nothing to do with how Rias enjoyed playing in the snow. Rias wondered if that was why she attached so much meaning to being the heiress and one day becoming the Duchess Gremory. Perhaps it had less to do with pride and more to do with utility. If she couldn't escape the clan, she would simply subsume it instead and become the greatest part of the whole. It was certainly an easier road to being valued for more than merely existing. It wasn't exactly easy to find a lover in Gehenna who didn't give a flying hoot what the context that had created her was. Or maybe she was just that arrogant. Ads inviting some of the Belial clan over for a private dinner in a few days. You know, the whole rubbing shoulders, we're not friends, but we'll pretend we're the bestest buds sort of thing. Naruto's voice cut through her musing, changing the direction of her thoughts. To say the Belial clan were not friends was true, but it implied more animosity and false amity than there was. Daihauser Belial was similar to Saraerg, despite being much older and much more powerful. He had a sense of chivalry that made her parents well disposed towards him. If he had children, they would be higher than most on the list of potential spouses for the clan heir. Which had nothing to do with her, since Rias no longer had that position. A placid smile crossed her face as she moved to another rose bush to continue her gardening. I see. I'll hope that everything goes just as planned for them then. She could just imagine the way her nephew was bashfully scratching the back of his head. Mom and Dad said you don't have to come or anything, since it's more of a Satan-Lucifer thing than anything to do with the Gremory clan, but they'd like it if you would come. I'm sorry, but I have prior plans. Rias lied through her teeth, cupping a handful of green leaves to examine their health. I have already arranged an outing with Sona. Her friend was a pretty convenient excuse for backing out of things she didn't want to do. Years ago they'd come to the agreement to provide alibis for each other, so even if Naruto asked about it, Sona would confirm they would be spending the evening together. The hiss that escaped Naruto's mouth was annoyed, the redeed finally moving past his niggling of guilt in favor of irritation. He knew she was lying, even if he couldn't outright prove it, and her avoiding him and their family was starting to get on his nerves. Naruto generally didn't do delicate, and his response to disappointment was to get back up and try over and over again until he succeeded. Rias bowing out and hiding struck him as weak. So that's how things are going to play out, huh? For the first time since he'd walked into her garden, Rias paused. Then she straightened, foliage slipping through her fingers as she set her clippers down into an empty clay pot. When she turned to look down at the shorter redeed, her brows were drawn into an artful expression of befuddlement. Pardon. If you mean that I'll be spending the evening with Sona, then yes. Otherwise, I'm confused about what you're referring to. Naruto threw his hands up, making a rough encompassing gesture as he frowned irritably. I mean this. The whole ice princess thing you have going on. He could see the way frigidity was slowly working across Ria's face, but he was too invested to stop halfway. Like, I understand that you're mad. I'd be too. No one likes to lose. But it's not that big a deal, hellfire and ashes. I'll fight you anytime if you want to keep training to win. I'll even help you train if you want. So can we just skip the whole dramatic silences and go back to how things used to be? How things used to be. Rias almost felt like laughing. How did things used to be? Because what Rias remembered was happiness that slowly dimmed, consumed by being shunted to the side over the years in everyone's opinions. Her father was available less often to train her personally in sorcery, though she managed to catch glimpses of him mussing Naruto's hair after teaching the boy a tricky bit of magic. Her brother had less and less time to discuss politics or history with her, though he was always available for his son. Rafia had always been on the peripheral to begin with, consumed with her self-appointed maid duties. The only ones who really had the time for her had been her mother who didn't like battle or politics in the first place, and her nephew that had been slowly outshining her like the sun outshone the moon. But she refused to show any of that poison on her face because the fault wasn't really with Naruto for being strong. It was with Rias for being too weak to be worth anything to her own family. Value in Gehenna always came down to power anyway. Rias lifted an eyebrow. I don't really know what you're talking about. Sure, whatever you say, Rias. Smiling faintly at the slow-moving current of the small stream that cut through Starling Hall's estate, Keko plopped down on the river bank and peeled her shoes off. The water was pleasantly cool when the white-haired Nekomata slid her feet into the water and closing her eyes Keko drew in a slow inhale. She'd originally started coming down to the river just to enjoy the peace and quiet. Keko struggled with Ria's emotions and she didn't really understand how she was supposed to help her mistress. Ever since Kuroka had murdered their entire household, she'd adopted a policy of live and let live. The locus of control in her existence wasn't in her hands, so the only thing Keko would ever be able to do was stay still and bear whatever life threw at her. The concept of being able to choose what to do was alien. Keko couldn't help Rias when it came to deciding whether to try and build bridges with her family or seek comfort in isolation. Well, her mistress wasn't truly free, given that she was imprisoned by the expectations of her position. She had an order of magnitude more liberty than Keko. If it was the Nekomata, she couldn't solve her issues by running away or choosing to stay. Others made the choice in how they'd interact with her, and Keko simply had to accept it. A small part of her wondered if she was really content with that. There was a certain freedom of its own in giving up control. By giving up her choices, Keko was freed of so much uncertainty and conflict about the future. It ceased to be her concern save in the vaguest sense, and she was able to live totally in the present. Yet that comfort hadn't prevented her from choosing the river and the smell of nature. The deep earthy scent of soil mingled with the fragrance of flowers and just the faintest tang of fish swimming downstream. As a Nekomata, Keko had sharper senses than other devils, who in turn had better sense than humans. Her nose didn't simply filter clues about her surroundings in, it painted a world when she let it. Her ability to take in everything as part of a greater symphony was probably why she was so rattled by the sudden metallic smell of blood and the reek of old sweat. Gold orbs shot open and swiveled upstream in search of the disturbance. The bend in the river prevented her from immediately witnessing the source, but soon enough a dark blob rounded the curve and continued to float down the current towards her. Hazy lines quickly sharpened, and the Nekomata found herself raising one snowy brow in curiosity. Bobbing along was a teenager perched on top of a mossy log. The dark-haired boy was unconscious, arms and legs dragging freely in the cool stream, while his cheek pressed against the wet wood. He'd be devastatingly handsome, if not for the stringy filth of his hair and the way that starvation had hollowed him to skin and bone. "Wake up," she ordered as the stranger drew near, prompting a flicker of unconscious eyelids and a groan. The young man failed to rise though, and eventually drifted right past the 10-year-old. Unwillingly, her heart lurched. She didn't know what to do. There was no one to tell her what she should do. On the one hand, Keko could simply ignore him. Whatever unfortunate circumstances that had sent him bobbing on past were ultimately not her concern. Live and let live. On the other hand, she could pull him out of the river. It would be a conscious choice to assume some measure of control and give up that peace that came with surrender. It truly wasn't any of her business. But one day a few years ago a family of kind deeds had saved her from execution when they didn't have to. Cursing under her breath, Keko whipped out her pair of leathery bat wings and threw herself into the air. Sasuke woke with a gasp, eyes rolling frantically to take in the surroundings. White sheets, gold inlet lamps, a vast empty fireplace, pale blue ceramic floor tile, and huge windows that let in the artificial sunlight of the underworld. Cycling steady breaths to calm his racing pulse, the Uchiha slipped a cautious hand into the cool blue robes that had been wrapped around him. There was only the unmarked skin of his abdomen, wiry half-starved muscles absent wounds or scarring. Alive. Sasuke breathed in a wondering tone. "Do you want to live?" "Office." Casting another considering look about the bedroom, the Uchiha weighed the tasteful opulence. Obviously wealthy, but without the gaudy preferences of the nouveau rich. Had she pulled him off the battlefield and healed him then? Sasuke tossed the blankets to the side and clambered out of bed. Ignoring the cool sensation of the tiles on his bare feet, the devil tightened the ties of his robe before crossing the room and peeking his head out into the hallway. If he thought wealthy had adequately described the room he had just left, Sasuke was wrong. The hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly in both directions. Plush crimson carpet lined the floor, and the walls were covered with paintings and shelves holding jeweled vases. The display of lavishness was broken only by doors every 10 meters or so, marked by crystal chandeliers hanging overhead. "Ridiculous," he muttered before picking the rightwards corridor and striding down it. 20 pairs of doors passed by quickly with no end in sight. The only notable change being the different paintings he'd passed. At least the owner of the manse had enough sense to not buy repetitive mass-produced decoration. Should he return to the sick room he'd woken up in? Should he keep walking and hope that the corridor ended soon? Should he just begin trying doors at random? Settling his hands in his pockets, Sasuke sighed before returning the way he'd come. Bursting into rooms arbitrarily seemed like the kind of foolishness Naruto would have done. As for just wandering the halls, Sasuke would probably come to a wall or a staircase eventually, but then what? Just try to escape and run through the wildness clad in nothing but a breezy housecoat. It seemed like a ridiculous flight of fancy, especially if the manor belonged to office and she'd decided to take a more vested interest in his welfare. Which itself was almost absurd. He hadn't seen the little girl in 2 years. Sasuke had assumed she'd simply grown bored of lurking around him, but if she'd saved his life that rather implied she was stalking him without actually interacting with him. The Uchiha wasn't sure which prospect disturbed him more. Office the stalker or some unknown benefactor with unknown motives. "You're awake," greeted him as Sasuke recrossed the threshold into his room. Waiting patiently by the bed was a child that couldn't be more than 10 years old. The white-haired girl blinked her hazel orbs, folding petite hands behind her back. Combined with the crisp three-piece suit adorning her, the girl looked like some form of absurd prepubescent butler. But then again, appearance did not always match true age in a devil. As far as Sasuke knew, she might actually be a 3-century-old maidservant for some perverse lolicon ultimate-class devil, which wasn't a topic Sasuke wanted to dwell on too deeply. "Who are you?" the Uchiha belted out, discreetly centering his balance and clearing all emotion from his face to project strength. The manse might yet be Office's home, but Sasuke felt like the gothic Lolita would have greeted him herself. And if the home wasn't Office's, there was no saying whose or what's hands he'd ended up in. Given the way the white-haired girl eyed his feet, Sasuke hadn't been discreet enough. The girl coolly weighed his question before deciding that it did no harm to answer it. "Taoju Keko." Heading back across the room, Keko peered up at Sasuke's face for a moment. "Follow." Then she pushed past him, turning left without a backward glance. The faint frown of a thought creased Sasuke's brows, but quickly moved aside in favor of cultivated apathy. Trailing a meter behind the girl, the Uchiha kept wary eyes on both Keko and the surrounding walls. Their journey passed in silence, both not given to idle chatter. It turned out the left corridor was far shorter than the right, twisting a corner after 15 pairs of doors and revealing another scattering of rooms, along with a spiraling marble staircase. Keko led Sasuke up 2 floors, the tail of her blood-red tie swing as the pair twisted up and around to come face to face with a great pair of double doors. Pausing with a hand on the door handle, the white-haired girl warned Sasuke to be polite. Before ushering him inside. Stepping through the cherry frame, Sasuke was instantly assaulted by a kaleidoscope of color and light. The ceiling was domed, glittering with the glow of 1,000 individually covered stars. A mingling rainbow faintly reflected back off the shining black marble of the floor and walls. Combined with the absolute absence of any kind of furniture or decoration, it was almost like stepping into a cradle of infinity. The only disturbance in the simulated void was a fluffy bearskin spread out on the floor slightly off-center. Spread eagled haphazardly on it and staring absently at the constructed stars in thought was a crimson-haired princess. It was the only way the Uchiha could describe her. Turquoise eyes perched under sculpted blood-red eyebrows, gleaming faintly in a face made up of pale plains and gentle slopes that would make a sculptor weep. The verdant silk of her dress swept over her shoulders, crossing the generous curves of her breasts and the fertile swell of her hips before settling just above the knees. Peeking out of the ruffling edge of her dress were 2 knee-sock-clad calves, and the only ornament on her form was a single ruby crowned in a sun of gold that nestled just below the collarbone. Sasuke supposed the inhuman beauty was part of a devil's charms when it came to bargaining with humans. The girl looked just as he would have pictured a fairy queen if asked to. She was the vision of an innocent unspoiled Titania. Feeling absurdly underdressed in a pair of plain blue-gray pajama bottoms and a robe, Sasuke nonetheless carefully moved towards the girl and settled cross-legged on the very edge of the bearskin rug. Silence hung in the air between them, tense wariness on his part and musing thought on hers. "Do you like my star chamber?" Her voice cut through the air, blue-green regard refocusing away from the abyss of the ceiling to peer through the messy locks of her red bangs at him. Seeming content to wait on his answer, the crimson-haired girl watched Sasuke with a heavy gaze until he nodded with affirmation. The heavy gaze grew even weightier, and Sasuke wondered if he'd failed some test. But the only thing he could do was meet her eyes with a cold dark stare of his own. Some instinct warned him that trying to bullhead through things like Naruto would be not dangerous perhaps, but very ill-received. "What do you think of it?" "The star chamber?" Sasuke clarified, craning back slightly to catch the edge of the domed ceiling in his field of view. "Yes." Savagely repressing the urge to scoff, the Uchiha forced himself to consider the question. Was he supposed to answer honestly? Was he supposed to try and please her? But how could he? A few short minutes in company without introduction was hardly enough to accurately guess her preferences. Unless it was a trap. There was nothing for it but to answer honestly, Sasuke supposed. If they were going to kill him off for the arbitrary answer to some pseudo-philosophical question, it wasn't like he had the power to stop them. "You're weak." "Enough." "Solitude. It reminds me of walking through this world's darkness, and that so long as you don't shut your eyes, even the tiniest ray of light will reach you." "I see." Airy tones reached Sasuke's ears as she rolled onto her side and propped her head on her arm to better consider him. "Did you know I've asked that question many times ever since I saw this room? I've asked my parents. I've asked my brother, my nephew, my servants, and my friends. Every time, they've given me platitudes. It's beautiful, it reminds me of the pure night sky, it's like a shower of fireworks every time I get answers like those. You're the first person to suggest a different type of perception. Something beyond the obvious and the material." "I see." Sasuke muttered in reply, slightly unnerved by the sharp intensity of her regard. Switching topics, the Uchiha tugged at the collar of his robe and fired the question that had been niggling him since he woke up. "How did I get here?" The girl offered a wordless hum of acknowledgement before shrugging one shoulder. "Who could say? You washed up on the river dividing my estate. Kaneko-chan found you, so we took you in. Beyond that, you know more than I do." So, she knew just a little as Sasuke did. Damn. The shift from bleeding out in a forest to sleeping in a luxury suite was just a great black emptiness. The only clue was Office's voice in his ears as Sasuke bled everywhere, but even that might be a fever dream. "Do you want power?" The Uchiha was pulled out of his thoughts by a soft poke at his knee. "Well, if you don't know, I don't know. But what I do know is that I want to know who you are, stranger." "Uchiha Sasuke." He grunted, watching a thoughtful look cross her face as the girl touched a graceful finger to her full pink lips. "Uchiha Sasuke. Uchiha Sasuke. HNN, nope." She decided with a vaguely interested expression. "I've never heard of that family. Are you a reincarnated devil? Who is your master?" Denying her instantly, Sasuke glared, "I have no master." Which was probably a poor response given how the friendly light slipped right off her face and the muscles of her arms tensed. "Are you telling me you're a stray devil, Uchiha Sasuke-san?" A red spark flared into existence before swiftly extinguishing. There was nothing overt, but the threat was clear. Cold sweat broke out across Sasuke's back. No. Sasuke rushed to deny, squashing back the sudden lurch of his pulse. I've never had a master. I was just born in this underworld one day, and I've survived. I see. The girl mused, all hints of violence fleeing her taut form as she flopped to her back. Stray devils were those who had abandoned their masters after swearing loyalty and accepting evil pieces to join a peerage. The Henna in general expected devils to at least adhere to the letter of their agreement, but the real concern with stray devils came from them running wild with the enchanted chess pieces still inside of them. It was a threat to the social order. While most devils, even those of the lowest classes, had masters because of the feudal nature of their society and the bona fide serfdom of the peasantry, it wasn't unheard of for the odd devil to slip through the cracks. There was no technical law against moving from one clan's territory to another, so long as the devil in question accepted the rulings of the governing family, upheld their duty to them by paying taxes, and supported them during times of crisis. The crimson-haired girl likely assumed Sasuke was just another vagabond. And you? With a rush of irritation at her wandering attention, Sasuke clarified. Who are you? Rias Gremory. Rias Gremory. Moistening his suddenly dry lips, Sasuke swallowed. Rias Gremory of the Gremory family. The Gremory family of the 72 Pillars. The expression of annoyance that crossed Ria's features passed so quickly Sasuke half wondered if he imagined it. But he didn't imagine the peeved hum of confirmation. Shit. Sasuke had spent the last decade in almost complete isolation. Thieving and relying on office's alms for survival, the only person the Uchiha had truly spoken with more than a couple of random times was the Lolita, and after she'd vanished 2 years past he'd been basically a hermit. Despite all that, Sasuke was aware of the 33 clans that remained of the original 72 pillars. Gremory, just like Stolas or Astaroth or Baal, was a name of power. A clan of such absurd blue blood and wealth that it would make any human king green with envy. The entire government of Gehenna only functioned by the leave of those 33 clans, to the mingled bitterness and awe of commoner devils. They also elicited disgust from the extra demons that had sided with the old Satan faction in the Civil War and been excluded from government after peace was made. For the second time since being born into his second life, Sasuke was acutely aware of his own fragile mortality. The girl sprawled before him could obliterate the Uchiha with a single order, assuming Rias didn't just do it herself with a barely hidden vast well of magical power. Sasuke could feel skirting on the edge of his senses. I see. Sasuke offered for lack of a better comment. Well, if he was about to die, at least he would die comfortable. Loosening the belt of his borrowed robe for breathability, Sasuke twisted and flopped down on his back. The fur of the bearskin rug cradled his head even as the lower half of his body stretched out over the cool black marble. Magnificent artificial stars weren't what Sasuke would have chosen for the last thing to see in his life, but there were worse visions. Suffocating silence gave way to a more amicable quiet as the minutes ticked by without Sasuke getting blown to pieces or threatened into some form of servitude. The Gremory princess didn't even offer to pay him to do some form of dirty work. It kind of violated his expectations of hedonistic nobility. It was almost nice. The stillness was companionable enough. No pointless chatter filled the air. There was only the soft sound of breathing as the two young devils weighed their own thoughts. If not for the exaggerated fear of death and need for survival engendered by his recent fight, Sasuke would admit he even enjoyed it. Do you have any friends, Uchiha Sasuke-san? Sasuke barely had to think about it. Kakashi, Sakura, Team Taka, they weren't friends really. They were friendly allies, but Sasuke had never considered the former three his confidants. And if she'd truly saved his life, she didn't consider it worth enough to stay around until he woke up. Someone like that wasn't someone Sasuke would easily label with the coveted title of friend. Naruto was his friend though, his brother even, and the Uchiha opened his mouth to answer affirmatively. But Naruto was living his life in the other world. Whatever fucked up process it was that summoned Sasuke to a new life in a new body, he was alone. There were no friendships this side of the void, and his jaw clicked shut. No. Not anymore. Blinking back the faint hot sting in the corners of his eyes, Sasuke glared determinedly at the ceiling. It didn't matter. He'd survived almost his entire life without relying on bonds with others. Even when he acknowledged those bonds, they were so distant that they had no impact on his life most of the time. That sounds lonely, Uchiha Sasuke. It sounds like none of your business, Rias Gremory. He bit out with instinctive defensive rudeness, only to tense up once more. Sasuke's nervousness was unfounded, as the blue blood devil only huffed a laugh at the Uchiha's snark. Cloth and fur rustled as Rias rolled onto her stomach, shimmying across the rug until she hovered within arm's reach of the dark-haired devil. Tracing an errant hand boldly across the weaker devil's face, Rias paused with her pale hand cupped the curve of Sasuke's jaw. Solitude. The ruined princess pondered absently, brushing a thumb over the Uchiha's slightly open mouth and ignoring the reluctant enthrallment in his dark eyes. Are you lost in darkness, Uchiha Sasuke? Sea green eyes grew hot and intent as Rias brought her other hand forward. There was a certain desperate brittleness in her gaze that made all of Sasuke's instincts scream in suspicion, but he was too absorbed already. Cradled within her elegant fingertips was a clear crystal chess piece. The pawn began to glow with crimson light, dominating over the soft rainbow that was twinkling away in the midnight dome. Shall I show you a light? Hey Gramps. Zeoticus gave a lazy wave at his grandson's greeting, flipping to the next page of Prince Itri's proposed legislation. He could see Seraphal's hand in it as clear as day. The Satans were not as subtle as they thought they were. In principle, the Duke didn't really oppose the idea of a central army. He'd lived long enough to see human civilizations rise and fall and knew that centralization was an essential part of the formation of the nation-state. If Gehenna was going to become a unified country rather than a confederation of practically independent clan fiefdoms, power would have to be yielded to the diabolical Senate. Yet Zeoticus was wary. As inefficient as the Senate was, since any motion in it depended on clan alliances and every legislator except the four Satans inherited their position by right of blood, was it worse than the alternative? The entire reason Shield had proceeded from an absolute monarchy under the great King Baal to a junta dictatorship under the old Satans and then the loose collection of clan warlords it was at the present was because revolutions against the previous abuses of authority. A lot of blood had been spilled because the great king or the Satans had hungered for more power and more glory. Would giving more power to the Senate bring back those dark days? Or would it finally move Gehenna along the road to a more efficient and more stable form of government? Huffing a sigh, Zeoticus beckoned Naruto over and shoved the thin booklet into his hands. What do you think, kiddo? His grandson was a bit of a genius oddball, and while the Duke would make the final decision, maybe he could turn the whole thing into an intellectual exercise with his heir. Naruto gave his grandfather an odd look, but did as he was asked and began to skim over the pages. I don't really get it. What's the problem? The 10-year-old prodded. If his grandfather was so deep in thought about it, maybe there was something Naruto wasn't seeing. But other than that, he kind of supported the whole idea. It reminded him of the allied shinobi forces, minus the whole Madara is going to destroy everything vibe. Do you just not want to give up your own power or something? The question might offend other more high-strung nobles, but Zeoticus was much more mild. Ignoring the thoughtless implication that it might just be lust for power, the Duke tugged the proposed law out of Naruto's hands and tossed it on the desk. The question isn't really about personal power, since the prince isn't suggesting the clans need to abolish their own armies. There is an increase in taxes of course, which might affect the more greedy, but every clan could offset that by cutting their military spending or trimming back on conspicuous consumption. Well, it's not like we're hurting for cash or anything. Naruto shrugged, blue eyes growing a touch impatient. As interesting as the impromptu lesson was, he had other reasons for bothering his grandfather. So if the reason you're questioning it isn't because you don't want to reduce your own power or wealth, it must be because you don't want to give more authority or money to the Senate. Smiling slowly, Zeoticus propped his chin in his hand and ran a thumb over the scruff of his stubble. You're getting there. Finish the thought. But if it was that simple, you would just vote against it. Go on. Naruto's brow furrowed, the 10-year-old deep in thought as he struggled to see it from his grandfather's point of view. I got nothing, y'all like to call me a genius, but I'm no mind reader. Ruffling the boy's hair, Zeoticus gave a wink. Are you sure? Take a guess. What am I thinking of right now? Breasts. How did you know? Well, you are the harem king. Naruto grunted, hoisting himself up on the desk and glaring down at his grandfather. But enough bullshitting, just tell me already so we can move on. The crimson brow slowly inched up as Zeoticus stared at the impudent 10-year-old. Careful brat, I might tell your mother about how you talk to me. I'm starting to think you like the taste of soap, given how much you seem to go looking for excuses to have her wash your mouth out. Oh, come on Gramps, it's all in good fun. If you can't handle the banter just tell me. You don't have to go crying to mom about it. Touché. To get to the point, yes, there are benefits to voting for and against. When your tutors begin to discuss more modern parts of history and politics, you'll learn that centralizing authority is part of stabilizing a country and making ruling it more efficient. But centralization also makes rebelling against corrupt authority more difficult, and I think that Gehenna has seen enough ruled by power-hungry dictators. Preserving local rule and clan power make it much harder for a small cabal to drag the whole realm into another war. Naruto chewed the inside of his cheek and ran an absent thumb over the collar of his white button-up shirt. Fair enough. Maybe what you should do is vote against this, but suggest something else instead that makes the government more efficient without giving it power. What does it need an army for anyway? If some clan rebelled, you'd all dogpile it, and if someone invaded, you'd all dogpile him. Zeoticus reached up and gave his grandson's nose a rough tweak. Are you sure you're not a mind reader? That was my exact train of thought. There are better avenues to pursue than the military one. Why not propose a law that limits what sort of laws clans can make locally, or one that requires an equality in criminal justice? But if the end goal is to abolish clan armies down the line and replace them with one controlled by the central state, then this would be a good place to start. Dude, stop, you're making my head hurt. I didn't come here for a lecture. A fond chuckle bubbled up from Zeoticus's chest. If you say so, Neri-chan. I believe you had something to ask me. I'm not a Chan, the heir to the Gremory clan grumbled before giving a long sigh. How do I fix this whole I hate you thing Rias has going on right now? Because let me tell you, it's getting pretty old pretty quick. Used to be that I had a partner in crime when it came to putting fish in dad's pillowcases. Now she won't even talk to me without being 100 different kinds of awkward. A mixture of nostalgia and pain lit up Zeoticus's mind. At the end of the day, such childhood conflicts were eventually forgotten. Something that would seem like the end of the world when one was a child became an amusing memory decades later. The Duke had no doubt that Ria's tiff with Naruto over being ousted as heir presumptive seemed like the end of the world for his daughter, yet deep down Rias didn't want to truly lead the clan in the first place. It had been just a convenient distraction for the girl, since it was easier to seek power than love in Gehenna. Devils were often lost to their lusts, making the explicitly romantic love Rias wanted very difficult to find. His daughter hadn't clued in yet that the validating love she wanted she already got from her friends. Which wasn't unusual as far as Zeoticus was concerned. The young seemed to think that romance was the be-all and end-all of love. He blamed Hollywood. It wasn't in his nature to spill all those revelations to Naruto, since they were Ria's feelings and not his to share. However, no parent liked to see their child in pain. Or their grandchild for that matter. So Zeoticus decided to throw Naruto a bone rather than let them flounder through their adolescent conflict. Just keep trying. The re-dared man advised, carefully weighing his words. He wanted to send Naruto down the right path without giving up too many of Ria's personal thoughts. Rias does love you, even if she's jealous right now. Well, I told her that if she wanted I'd help her train and give her a duel anytime. Zeoticus winced at his grandson's fumble. That wasn't a smart choice. If I can be honest, you came across as a pretty big arrogant asshole there. And your power isn't what Rias is really jealous about in the first place. Well then what the hell is it? Your mother is going to skin us alive. You, me, and your father. We'll be 3 flayed men in a row. Zeoticus lamented, pinching the bridge of his nose at his grandson's reflexive dirty mouth. What Rias is jealous of is less your power and more your assurance. Compared to her, you've always had a purpose in your life. You've always seemed to know what you want, regardless of other people's opinions. However, in Gehenna a devil is valued less by who they are and more by what they achieve. Despite my best efforts, she's internalized that view, but she rejects it too. It's created a bit of an odd situation where she values herself based on what she can do, but wants to be valued by other people based on who she is. Naruto mulled that over. Sounds psychotic. He muttered, yelping when his grandfather gave him a smack around the head. Don't be a little smart ass. His grandfather warned, giving of an air of amused long-suffering. I know it'll probably be hard. Brats have a way of holding grudges forever. I wasn't any better when I was your age. But I know that you'll manage to patch things up eventually. Just accept her overtures when she makes them and don't push around too hard. Rias will have to figure out her purpose on her own. Considering you were the one that pulled the rug out from under her, any attempt you make to help is just going to have her clam right up. I get it. Geez. Any other advice, oh wise and powerful sage of family relationships? When it's that time of the month for a woman, either do your best to appease her or get the hell out of there. I knew that already, you geezer. What if Naruto was blessed by Shinigami in high school DxD, and thanks for watching my video till the end. If you enjoy this content then do consider subscribing to my channel and leave a like if you guys need the next part, comment down, and thanks for watching the video and see you guys in the next video.